Chapter 1. Mr. Lockwood's First Visit to Wuthering Heights. I have rented an amazing house named Thrushcross Grange in a rather lonely section of England. The only other house located nearby is Wuthering Heights, inhabited by my new landlord. He appears to be just as happy as I am to live his life alone. When I had settled, I saddled my horse and crossed the land to introduce myself to him. Judging by the look on his face, he didn't seem the least bit happy to see me, and in fact he hardly spoke beyond what was absolutely necessary. He was leaning on the gate as if to keep it closed. I inquired to determine if he were Mr. Heathcliff. He nodded affirmatively that he was indeed my new landlord. I supplied him my name. "Mr. Lockwood, sir. I want to inform you how simply pleased I am to be living at Thrushcross Grange." "Come in," he directed, but his words were meaningless, for he only opened the gate when my horse pushed firmly against it. As we neared the front entryway, he summoned his servant and said, "Joseph, take Mr. Lockwood's horse and bring some wine for us." This indicated Heathcliff kept only the one servant, who had to do both the outside as well as the inside duties associated with the home. I thought, why, it's no wonder the gardens and fields look dreadfully untidy. Joseph was quite elderly and looked at me angrily as he secured my horse, at his boss's request. The house was built of the most solid of stone and was extremely strong. The house was adorned with narrow windows because of the fierce storms experienced in this part of England. Before entering the house, I stopped upon noticing some writing carved above the door which said Hareton Earnshaw, 1500. I wanted to query Heathcliff about this carving, but I could easily see by his facial expression he was rather impatient for me to either move forward or else depart, so as not to intrude any further. So I entered. There was no foyer, so we found ourselves immediately in the living room. I could hear people talking from elsewhere, and some pots and pans being utilized in the kitchen that was somewhere beyond inside the house. I allowed my eyes to observe the room. There was a huge collection of shelves with a multitude of silver jugs and plates, some old guns displayed on the walls, and a few heavy green wooden chairs set about on the white stone floor. Several dogs were lazing in the corners of the room, and one of them was lying with her puppies. It resembled a farmer's room, but Mr. Heathcliff did not have the appearance of a farmer. He had a dark complexion and dressed and acted like a gentleman through and through, although he was not very tidy. He actually seemed to be a lot like me. I find it ever so difficult to be friendly to people. I recall an instance last summer. I met a beautiful girl and I was quite attracted to her, but I could not bring myself to speak to her. I just looked at her from a distance. When she finally looked back my way, I became so confused that I could not be friendly with her at all, and soon she and her mother left and my chance was forever gone. For reasons such as that, people think I have no heart, but I assure you they are wrong. However, I think Mr. Heathcliff truly is like that. I took a seat near the fireplace, and the dog with the puppies left them and stood by my legs. I attempted stroking her with my hand, but she growled at me. And Mr. Heathcliff growled as well. "Leave the dog alone. It's a hunting dog, not a pet." He moved to the doorway and shouted, "Joseph." I could hear Joseph moving about in the cellar, but he did not come as summoned, so Mr. Heathcliff descended the stairs to find him, leaving me alone with the dogs. I decided I should not touch them, but the mother of the puppies suddenly began barking and jumping on me. I pushed her away, but all the other dogs joined in on the barking. I was quite fearful they wanted to bite me, so I maneuvered my position and managed to place myself so the table was between them and me, and defended myself handily with the poker from Heathcliff's fireplace. I called out loudly for help. I could hear Mr. Heathcliff and Joseph coming, but ever so slowly up the stairs from the cellar of Wuthering Heights. But before they arrived, a rotund woman from the kitchen rushed into the room. She hit the dogs with a pan she carried and shouted loudly at them. They almost immediately ceased their attack and returned to their original places. The woman went back to the kitchen, and it was suddenly very quiet. Mr. Heathcliff arrived with his servant in tow. He asked, "What's happened?" I replied, "Your dogs attacked me." He said, "They won't attack if you don't touch anything." He followed that with, "Would you like some wine?" I declined with a polite, "No thank you." He asked, "Did they bite you?" "No," I said. "I would have kicked them if they had." Mr. Heathcliff smiled a bit. "You needn't worry," he told me. "You're upset. It is rare that we have visitors here at Wuthering Heights, so my dogs and I are not accustomed to catering to them. Do share some wine." I certainly didn't want to start a quarrel, so I agreed, and we spent a significant amount of time talking about Thrushcross Grange. I tentatively suggested that I would visit again tomorrow or soon after, and although Heathcliff didn't seem to really welcome the idea, I decided I shall visit anyway. I admit, I liked my new landlord. Chapter 2. Mr. Lockwood visits Wuthering Heights again. The air yesterday afternoon was bitterly cold and terribly damp, and I desired nothing more than to relax at home near the heat of a fire. However, one of the servants had chosen this day of all days to clean the fireplace, so I walked 4 long miles through the thick mud to visit my landlord at Wuthering Heights. As I arrived at his gate, snowflakes began drifting down from the heavy gray clouds. I knocked heavily on the door at Wuthering Heights until the searing pain in my hand forced me to cease the pounding. The dogs fiercely howled, yet my call was never answered. The temperature was blisteringly cold, and for that reason, if no other, I decided to enter even though there was no answer. I reached for the handle and shook it, and at that moment Joseph stuck his head out from the window of the barn. He shouted, "What do you want?" When I didn't immediately answer, he offered, "The master's down with the sheep. Go round the back if you wish to speak to him." I inquired, "Is there anyone inside to open the door and let me in?" He replied, "There's only the wife, and she won't open the door if you shout all day." I asked, "Can you tell her it's me?" He answered angrily, "Not me." He quickly disappeared from sight. The snow was falling heavier now, and I resumed my shaking of the door handle. A young man carrying a pitchfork arrived in the yard and requested I follow him. So I dropped my hand from the handle and followed his lead. He led me to another door. It was a different entry from the one we used on my first visit. Regardless of the entry, we ended up in the very room I had visited the previous day. A large fire was raging in the fireplace, and the table was appropriately set for a meal. A woman, no doubt the lady of the house, rested in a nearby chair. She looked at me but offered no comments. I remarked, "It's terrible weather." I waited, but she didn't reply, and we stared at each other. The young man who had led me to this room said, "Sit down." He continued, "He'll be here soon." I attempted to start a conversation again, this time about the dogs and puppies, which were in the room as they had been just the day before. I said, "She's a beautiful dog." Then I asked, "Are you going to keep the puppies?" At last the woman responded, "They're not mine." Her voice was horribly ugly, and her tone unfriendly. Not to be put off, I tried again. I remembered I thought I saw some cats near a window, so I said, "So these are your favorites?" She answered, "Strange favorites." I looked again and saw that they were not cats at all, but instead they were dead rabbits. I felt ever so uncomfortable, so I repeated myself, "It's terrible weather." I didn't know what else to say or how best to initiate a conversation. How should I handle this situation I had found myself in? I felt incredibly stupid. She said, "You should have stayed home." She stood to retrieve some tea from a high shelf along one side of the room. As she reached up, I noticed she was more a girl than a woman. In years she was young, and her body was slim. Her head was covered with beautiful blonde hair, and she was graced with a small pretty face, but her eyes were hard and cold. I extended an offer to help her, but she quickly insisted she needed none of my help. She said coldly, "I can do it myself." As she was about to place some tea in the pot, she asked, "Were you invited for tea?" "No," I answered. She halted her actions and sat again. She and the young man, who was dressed like a servant, but certainly did not act like one, looked at me as if I were a much-feared enemy. I wanted to depart for home, but now I was afraid of losing my way in the storm. So when Heathcliff finally arrived, I asked if he could let me have the services of one of his servants to guide me home. He quickly said with no remorse, "No, I can't." The young man rudely asked the girl, "Are you going to make the tea?" She addressed Heathcliff. "Is he having any?" she asked, nodding her head toward me. He replied, "Get it ready, will you?" I was quite surprised at how cruel his words sounded, and I liked him less at that particular moment. She fixed the tea and we sat around the room to eat and drink together. As we partook of the food, I complimented Heathcliff on his fine wife and family, but he responded angrily that his wife was deceased. This youthful girl was not his wife at all, but was married to his son. Heathcliff glanced her way and I could see instantly that he hated her strongly. I continued to make errors. I mistakenly thought the young man was her husband, yet I was wrong again. Heathcliff said with a poisonous tone, "He is not my son is dead." The young man chimed in with the correct information. "My name is Hareton Earnshaw." His eyes stared into mine. I rose and moved toward the window so as to look out, and I saw what I feared. The storm had worsened. I asked for opinions about what I should do, but no one offered the best course of action. In fact, no one answered at all. I was amazed that no aid was offered, and they all left the room except Mrs. Heathcliff. Joseph then entered the room and told her she was lazy. He was really very cruel to her, and I was shocked. He meanly said, "You're just as bad as your mother." The young woman moved to the shelf to fetch a large black book. She pretended she was a witch who planned to cast a spell to bring Joseph bad luck. These actions frightened him, and he chose to quickly depart. I begged for details so I could be gone from Wuthering Heights. "Please, tell me how to get home." She replied in her same cold tone, "Go the way you came." She continued, "There is no one that can help you. The only people here are Heathcliff, Earnshaw, Joseph, Zillah the cook, and me." I replied, "Then I must stay." She told me, "That's up to him." By him she meant Heathcliff. Heathcliff acquiesced so I could stay. However, he said I would have to share quarters with Hareton or Joseph if I chose to stay at his home. I preferred not to intrude, and I offered to sleep on a chair in the large room where we had just shared tea, but he quickly denied that offer, for he wanted no strangers roaming around his house at night while he was asleep. I was angered by his rudeness. I decided to leave, for it seemed better to leave and try and find my way home alone. I heard the young man Hareton offer to guide me a portion of the way to Thrushcross Grange, but Heathcliff denied this offer of help, and instead ordered him to care for the horses. Mrs. Heathcliff mentioned that if the stranger died, it would be Heathcliff's fault. Joseph came toward me with a lantern. I accepted it, so I might be able to start my journey for home. But Heathcliff called the dogs, and they knocked me down and kept me on the ground until Heathcliff arrived and stared down at me. Heathcliff simply laughed at my situation as he looked down at me as I lay on the ground, and he stood above me. I was injured. My nose was bleeding. Zillah rushed to see what was creating all the noise, and then she accompanied me inside, where Heathcliff insisted she supply me with a drink. At long last, she finally led me to a bedroom upstairs. Chapter 3. Mr. Lockwood Dreams at Wuthering Heights. As Zillah led me upstairs to my bedroom for the night, she encouraged me to remain very quiet in the room, as Mr. Heathcliff really didn't like people being there at all. No one was allowed in the room. The bed was positioned by the window, so I placed my candle on the window ledge next to it and climbed in to slumber. The window ledge contained some books, and the names Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Heathcliff, and Catherine Linton were written on the walls. I kept reading the three names over and over until I fell asleep. I woke up a mere 5 minutes later, only to discover that the candle was placed far too close to the books. I feared starting a fire, so I moved it and began to look inside the fascinating old books. Catherine Earnshaw had written her name in them. She had written many notes and drawn many illustrations on the pages inside. She had even drawn a picture of Joseph as a younger man and written several diary entries. I found one diary entry particularly interesting. "This is an awful Sunday. It has rained all day. I wish my father were still alive. Hindley is horrible. He and Francis are stopping us from having fun because it is Sunday. Joseph helps them. He made us go to church and tells them everything we do. The master is only just dead, and they are playing, he said. Hindley put us in the kitchen to sit there and read books. Heathcliff and I don't want to read books, so we are going to sneak outside into the rain and play there. Hindley is especially horrible to Heathcliff. He says he is a rogue and won't let him sit with the family when we have meals. He blames our father for treating him too well." I fell asleep while reading these pages and had a nightmare about going to church and arguing with the minister. I woke when a tree branch rattled against the window but returned to sleep soon after, and I dreamed yet again. In this dream, I tried to open the window and push the tree branch away. In order to do so, I broke the window and reached out to the branch. However, it was not a tree branch at all. It was a young girl's arm. The girl asked to be let in, and she claimed her name was Catherine Linton. She grasped onto my hand, and I tried to force her to let go by rubbing her arm over the broken glass of the window so that her blood dripped onto the bed. I promised to help her if she let go of me. When she agreed, I quickly placed the books in front of the hole in the window, and she began to plaintively wail and would not stop. Then the books began to move, and I screamed in fright. This woke me from this terrible dream, but it unfortunately woke Heathcliff too, for he entered the darkened room. He whispered, "Is anybody there?" I sat up in the bed, which frightened Heathcliff to a great degree. I told him who I was, and he walked over to the bed. He asked, "Who let you into this room?" I explained to him that Zillah had brought me to the room, and that I had terrible nightmares about a girl called Catherine Linton, whose name I saw on the wall. I said I would not stay there longer but go home, though it was the middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning to be exact. He was visibly upset by my story and asked me to leave him alone in the room. I looked over my shoulder to see him climb onto the bed, open the window, and beg for Catherine to come in again. I descended the stairs to the kitchen and sat near the fireplace. After a while, Joseph joined me and smoked a pipe before leaving again. Then, Hareton Earnshaw came in looking for a spade to clear the snow from the path. Hareton was angry and unhappy and did not voice a word. I went into the large room where Zillah was starting the fire and Mrs. Heathcliff was trying to read a book. Heathcliff was there too, and he was complaining about Mrs. Heathcliff's laziness because she refused to do any work whatsoever. Heathcliff was about to hit her, but I moved to warm myself at the fire, and this prevented any violence. I decided against sharing breakfast with them, and Heathcliff ventured with me across the moor to the gates of Thrushcross Grange. The path was very difficult to see in the snow, but we arrived safely. I was simply exhausted and went upstairs immediately, where I changed my clothes because mine were so wet. I paced back and forth trying to make myself feel warm again. Then I entered my study, where the servants had started a cheerful fire and brewed some hot coffee. I felt so feeble, though, that I didn't know if I would enjoy it. Chapter 4. How Heathcliff Comes to Wuthering Heights. That evening, when my housekeeper, Mrs. Dean, who was sometimes called Ellen or Nellie, brought me my supper, I asked her to join me while I ate. I implored her to tell me the history and stories about Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. After a little encouragement, she was pleased enough to chat about the families who inhabited these two houses. She explained to me that Mrs. Heathcliff was the widow of Heathcliff's son, and that her name was Catherine Linton before she married. She was the daughter of the previous owner of Thrushcross Grange, but he was dead too. I was surprised at the name, but soon realized she could not possibly be the same Catherine Linton as the one I had seen in my horrible nightmares from the night I had spent at Wuthering Heights. I wanted to know about Hareton Earnshaw, and Mrs. Dean told me that he was the young widow's cousin. Catherine's husband had been her cousin too. One cousin was born on her mother's side, and the other came from her father's side. Rather complex it was. Much time had passed since my housekeeper had seen Catherine, and Mrs. Dean inquired about Mrs. Heathcliff. "I'd like to know how she is." I answered her query. She looked well but seemed rather unhappy. She replied, "I'm not surprised." Then Mrs. Dean warned me that Heathcliff was a rough man, and that I should avoid him as much as possible. She told me the less I had contact with him, the better I would be. When I asked about his origin, she shared this story with me. I have been employed at Thrushcross Grange for 18 years. Prior to that, when I was but a child, I used to visit Wuthering Heights quite often. My mother nursed Hindley Earnshaw when he was growing up. You know, Hindley was Hareton Earnshaw's father, and I played with him and his sister Catherine. One day, Hindley's father ventured to Liverpool, and he promised to buy Hindley a violin and Catherine a riding whip. 3 days later, he returned with a dreadfully dirty and hungry boy he found living on the streets. The boy had no home to speak of, and no one knew who his parents were. Mr. Earnshaw decided to take this boy home and look after him, who was graced with a dark complexion. I was sent to wash and dress him properly. The presents Mr. Earnshaw had promised his own children were broken or lost, so the children were disappointed and upset. Mrs. Dean continued her tale. At first, Catherine and Hindley refused to let the boy sleep in their rooms. They were selfish. However, a few days later, Catherine and the new boy became friends. Hindley, though, continued to hate him. Hindley and I bullied him, which made old Mr. Earnshaw's temper flare. The new boy was named Heathcliff. He was a patient boy and rarely complained, and Mr. Earnshaw grew very fond of him, while being less fond of Hindley and Catherine, who were his very own offspring. Heathcliff quickly learned and used the old man's affection for him to his advantage. Once, Hareton bought 2 young horses and gave one to each of the boys as a gift. Heathcliff took the best one for himself, but it soon became lame. He told Hindley, "Give me yours. If you don't, I will tell your father that you hit me and show him the marks on my arms, as evidence of your beating." Hindley threatened him with a heavy iron weight, but Heathcliff was not afraid. "If you hurt me," Heathcliff said, "I will tell your father that you intend to throw me out of the house when he dies, and he will throw you out instead." Hindley hurled the weight and hit Heathcliff in the chest. "Take my horse then," shouted Hindley. "I hope it breaks your neck." He pushed Heathcliff under the horse and ran off. The horse kicked Heathcliff, but this did not worry him, for he had what he wanted. A few years later, Mr. Earnshaw fell very ill, and he was too weak to do anything but sit by the fireplace. He became ever so angry about the smallest problems. He was especially angered if anyone did anything to upset Heathcliff. This was disastrous for several reasons. Heathcliff felt even more important, while Hindley's jealousy grew even wilder. Eventually, Hindley was sent to college, but even his absence did not bring peace to the house. Joseph, the servant, convinced old Mr. Earnshaw that Heathcliff was a naughty boy, but that Catherine was even worse. Catherine did behave badly sometimes, but Joseph turned her father against her. Catherine's biggest problem was that she liked Heathcliff too much. In fact, she had grown to love him. She loved to be with Heathcliff every waking moment and was very upset if she was separated from him. The two of them would play together all day and create all sorts of mischief. Mrs. Dean continued to speak. After being troublesome, she would sometimes approach her father and try to kiss him, but he would tell her to go away. He had no desire to forgive her or her mischief. "I cannot love you," he would say. "You are worse than your brother." At first, this would make her cry, but she gradually grew accustomed to it and just laughed and refused to apologize for anything she did wrong. Mrs. Dean vividly recalled one day when there had been a terrible storm and everyone was sitting by the fire. Catherine was sick then and was sitting quietly near her father. He said, "Why can't you always be a good girl, Catherine?" She looked at him and laughed. "Why can't you always be a good man, father?" she replied. She saw that he was unhappy with this answer, so she began to sing softly to him, and he fell asleep. We sat around the hearth until it was time to retreat to bed, but when we tried to wake the master, Catherine discovered that he was dead. Mrs. Dean continued her story. We all cried except Joseph, who told us it was wrong to cry because the master had gone to heaven and that we should be happy. I left to bring the doctor from the village, and when I returned, the children were in their room comforting each other by imagining what heaven was like. Chapter 5. The New Master of Wuthering Heights. Mrs. Dean continued to speak. Hindley now assumed the role as the new master of Wuthering Heights and came home from the university for the funeral of his father. It had been 3 years since he left, and he amazed us by bringing home a wife, for no one knew she existed until that moment. Hindley had never informed his father about the marriage. We all assumed that the new bride probably had no money, but we never did learn where she was born or the details of her family. She was an extremely happy girl, and everything she saw seemed to delight her. She was very excited to see Wuthering Heights, and ran through the house peering into all the rooms and looking at all the furniture. She hated the funeral immensely, and cried when she saw the mourners. I remember her telling me she hated seeing the color black, because she was afraid of dying. Hindley had changed in the years he had been away at college. He was thinner and his skin was paler. He dressed differently, too. He informed Joseph and me that servants were not part of the family and ordered us to stay in the kitchen unless there was work to do in the house. Hindley's new wife was friendly with Catherine for a short time and gave her presents, but this soon halted. Hindley's wife didn't care for Heathcliff, and Hindley stopped Heathcliff's lessons and made him live with the servants and work on the farm. Catherine still loved Heathcliff, so she taught him her lessons and worked and played with him in the fields. Hindley did not care what they did as long as he didn't see them, and he really didn't mind if they didn't attend church services on Sundays either. This greatly irritated the church cleric, who stated that they should be punished for their inappropriate behavior. Heathcliff was harshly beaten, and Catherine was refused meals. She wasn't allowed to have dinner. However, they laughed, and the next week they did it again. One Sunday night, Catherine and Heathcliff had been sent from the living room for making too much noise, and when I called them for supper, they were not present in their rooms. We could not locate them, and Hindley grew angry. He ordered us to lock the house so that they could not enter upon their return to the premises, and then we all went to bed. I lay awake by the window, and when I heard footsteps outside, I approached them to warn them of Hindley's anger. I saw Heathcliff, but not Catherine. I asked, "Where is Catherine?" I was extremely worried that she had gotten hurt. Heathcliff answered, "At Thrushcross Grange." He continued, "I should be there too, but they did not invite me to stay." I asked, "Why is she there?" Heathcliff told me about their evening. He said, "We went there to see if they are unhappy in their house too." We peered through the window and saw that it was a wonderful house full of beautiful furniture, and we saw the children, Isabella and Edgar Linton. It bothered us because they should be happy in such a nice house, but they were quarreling about a little pet dog. We laughed though, because we find it silly to quarrel about a pet. Catherine and I would never quarrel about something like that and make ourselves unhappy. They heard us laugh and came out to see who it was. We attempted to escape, but a huge dog caught Catherine by the leg. I tried to get her free and cursed at the dog, but a servant came. He told the dog to hold on, but when he saw that it was a little girl, he called the dog away. Catherine's leg was bleeding and she could not walk, so the servant carried her inside and I followed him. He told Mr. Linton that he had caught some robbers. When Isabella saw me, she wanted to put me in the cellar because I looked like a thief, and she said I was ugly and dirty and horrible. Then Edgar recognized Catherine. They criticized Hindley for allowing Catherine to play with me on the moors. I cursed at them and they dragged me outside. I waited for Catherine, but she didn't come out. When I looked through the window again, I saw that she was sitting on the sofa and the Lintons were looking after her. They washed her feet and her hair and gave her cakes to eat. It was clear they admired her because she is better than them. She is the best person in the world, isn't she, Nellie? Mrs. Dean continued to speak. They sometimes call me Nellie. I had to reply. I said, "This will cause a lot of trouble." I was right. So much trouble arose when Hindley learned of the events that had transpired. Hindley was immensely angry. The next day, Mr. Linton visited Wuthering Heights and suggested that Hindley look after his family better. Hindley ordered Heathcliff not to speak to Catherine, and the new Mrs. Earnshaw promised to look after Catherine and keep her away from Heathcliff. Chapter 6. Heathcliff decides to be good. Mrs. Dean continued to speak. Catherine remained at Thrushcross Grange for 5 weeks, while her ankle healed. During this time, she learned how to dress and behave more like a lady, and when she returned home at Christmas, she surprised us all with her lovely gown and proper speech. Even Hindley was astounded, and he was especially delighted at how beautiful she looked, for her hair was different too, and fell in beautiful ringlets around her face. Heathcliff hid from sight, though, and refused to greet her. While Catherine had been away at Thrushcross Grange, he had grown dirtier and darker than ever before, and he rarely washed himself, his clothes, or his hair. His hair was unmanageable, long and tangled. Catherine asked, "Where is Heathcliff?" Hindley called for him to join them. He shouted, "Heathcliff, you may come and welcome Catherine home, like the other servants." Catherine saw him hiding, so she rushed to him. She had missed him and wanted nothing more than to hug and kiss him many times over. She laughed and said, "Look how dirty you are." She then compared him to the Lintons, and told him Isabella and Edgar were much cleaner. Hindley teased him, and Heathcliff tried to run away, but Catherine held him because her intention had not been to hurt him. "I didn't mean to laugh at you," she said. "I couldn't help myself. It was only because you looked odd. If you wash your face and comb your hair, you will be fine." Heathcliff shouted, "You didn't have to touch me." He ran from the room, but unfortunately, everybody except Catherine thought it was very funny and laughed at him. As master of Wuthering Heights, Hindley invited the Lintons to the house for a neighborly visit the next day. He wanted to thank them for looking after Catherine and offer them some presents for all they had done. Mrs. Linton agreed to come, but only if her children were kept well away from that dirty, naughty boy that swears all the time. She wanted her children to have no exposure to the likes of Heathcliff. Mrs. Dean continued, "I spent the rest of the day preparing everything for the visit. I swept the floors, shined the utensils, polished the clock, and arranged the mugs for the ale the guests would be served. Hindley wanted things to be well suited for the neighbors. As I worked, I remembered how Hindley's father, old Mr. Earnshaw, was so fond of Heathcliff, and how awful Heathcliff's situation was now. I was amazed how things can change, and I wished there was something I could do. I went outside and found Heathcliff brushing one of the ponies. 'Come inside,' I said. 'Hindley is not home. I will clean you and dress you nicely so you can sit and talk to Catherine before Hindley returns.' He ignored me and continued brushing the pony. 'Are you coming?' I asked. 'I have some little cakes for you as well.' I waited for 5 minutes, but he refused to say anything, so I returned to the house. Catherine ate with her brother and sister-in-law, and I ate a silent meal with Joseph in the kitchen. The next morning Heathcliff awoke early and went out onto the moors by himself. He returned only after the family went to church, and it was evident that he had been thinking deeply. 'Nellie,' he said, 'make me decent. I'm going to be good.' 'Excellent,' I said. 'You made Catherine very unhappy last night, and she cried sadly this morning when I told her that you had gone out onto the moors.' He asked if she had grieved, and when I replied that she had been so sad, he responded with, 'I cried more than she did.' I told him, 'That's because you went to bed proud and hungry, and proud people always make sorrows for themselves and others. If you are sorry, you should tell her. But first, I'll clean you and dress you, so that you look even better than Edgar Linton. You are younger but taller and stronger, and I'm sure you could knock him down in an instant.' Heathcliff smiled as he was pleased by my comments, but then he sighed. 'If I knock him down 20 times, it won't make him less handsome or me more handsome,' he said. 'I wish I had blonde hair and fair skin and was as rich as he will be.' I added, 'And cry for your mother and be afraid of the rain, and run away from every bully,' I told him. 'Look in the mirror. Look at your eyes. They look unfriendly and suspicious of everyone." Heathcliff said, "Wishing for Edgar's eyes won't help." "A good heart will improve your face," was my advice. "When you are clean and well-groomed and you've combed your hair, you will resemble a prince, I'm certain. Perhaps your father was the king of China, and your mother was the queen of India, and you were the victim of a kidnapping. Perhaps wicked sailors brought you to England." Heathcliff's spirits seemed better, and he began to be cheerful. But just as he opened the door to leave the kitchen, Hindley opened the door to come in. He saw Heathcliff and pushed him back. "Keep him out of the room," he demanded to Joseph. "He'll put his fingers in the cake and steal the fruit. Lock him in the attic. See how long his hair is? I'll pull it and make it longer." Edgar arrived just then and joined in the joking. He too made a joke about Heathcliff's long hair. Heathcliff seized a bowl of hot soup and threw it at Edgar's face, and Edgar screamed. Hindley picked up Heathcliff and carried him out as Catherine and Isabella rushed into the kitchen. Catherine admonished Edgar. She said the visit had been spoiled, and Heathcliff would be punished harshly. Catherine said, "You shouldn't have spoken to him." "I didn't," answered Edgar. "I promised Mother that I would not say one word to him, and I didn't." "Well, don't cry," Catherine said. "And you stop crying too, Isabella." When Hindley returned to the kitchen, everyone adjourned to the next room for dinner. Mrs. Dean continued speaking. After dinner was completed, there was a dance and some joyful singing for Christmas. A wonderful band that often went house to house played music. During this time I saw Catherine sneak upstairs to talk to Heathcliff, who had been banned to the attic. She brought him down to the kitchen, and I offered him some food, but he didn't eat much. He was focused on planning to take revenge on Hindley. Mrs. Dean stopped her story at this point. "It's 11 o'clock, she said. "You must be tired of the story." I was enthralled, though. No, I said. "Please, continue." She offered the option of making the story shorter by skipping over a few years, but I asked her to continue in detail because I wanted to know everything. "Well then," she said, "I must return to my story at the very next summer of 1778, which is nearly 23 years ago. Chapter 7. Happiness, Sadness, and Anger at Wuthering Heights. The story continued when Mrs. Dean told me that in June that year, Hareton Earnshaw was born. We were working in a distant field when we saw the girl who usually served breakfast running toward us shouting that the baby was born. This baby would be the last of the Earnshaw offspring. She said it was a beautiful baby boy, but the doctor said Mrs. Earnshaw was deathly ill and would die soon from tuberculosis. I rushed back to the house to see the baby, and as I arrived, I met Hindley. "The baby is well," he said with great happiness. He boasted. "He can almost walk already." "But how is Mrs. Earnshaw?" I asked. "The doctor said." Hindley exploded in anger and interrupted me before I could complete my sentence. He shouted, "I don't care what the doctor said. She will be fine." He told me that Dr. Kenneth had told Mrs. Earnshaw not to talk, but she wouldn't stop because of her cheerful personality. "You can go in to see her, but tell her not to talk," Hindley ordered me. When I went to her room to see her, she laughed. Her happy countenance stayed with her even as the disease took her. She said, "The baby just cries," so I laughed at him. Hindley denied vehemently that she would die, but she did indeed pass away just 1 week later. The responsibility of caring for the baby Hareton now fell solely to me, and I assumed the role of his caregiver. Hindley grieved miserably for his wife and did not care about anything else at all, and he became so difficult to live with that all the servants departed. Only Joseph and I remained at Wuthering Heights. Hindley's behavior was a bad example for Catherine and Heathcliff. He treated Heathcliff very badly, more so than before, if that was possible. However, Heathcliff seemed pleased to see Hindley become worse and worse. He derived great pleasure from Hindley's misfortune. Nobody dared to visit the house except Edgar Linton, who sometimes came to see Catherine, who was beautiful but proud and stubborn. At first, she was fiercely loyal to Heathcliff and to me. Edgar tried hard to be her friend, but it was difficult. Even his handsome looks and gentle personality could not swing Catherine's attention away from Heathcliff. Catherine often visited Thrushcross Grange, and when she was there, she maintained her politeness and behaved very well. A true lady she was. At home, though, she was rude and behaved terribly, for she knew that if she were polite there, everyone would laugh at her. Edgar visited Catherine at Wuthering Heights, but not very often. He greatly feared Hindley, and Catherine simply hated seeing Edgar and Heathcliff together, because they were so different in nature and did not like anything about each other. Heathcliff was 16 now and seemed to be happy to have no friends and live a life of solitude. He maintained his poor grooming. He kept himself dirty and ugly and scowled all the time. The only time he smiled was when he was with Catherine. One day Hindley left the premises, but before he left he told Heathcliff to work in the fields. Catherine seized this opportunity to invite Edgar to come to Wuthering Heights. She wore a nice dress and awaited his arrival. When Heathcliff came in to announce that he was not going to work in the fields, he saw Catherine wearing her lovely dress. He asked, "Are you going out?" She said, "No." "Then why are you wearing your silk dress?" asked Heathcliff. "Is someone coming here?" "I don't think so," she answered. "You should be working in the fields, Heathcliff." She really wanted him to depart so as not to cause additional turmoil between Heathcliff and Edgar. "I don't want to work," he said. "I'll stay here with you." Catherine was confused and didn't know what to do, so she decided it was best to admit that visitors might be calling. Finally, she said, "Edgar and Isabella said they might pay a visit. If they do, you will get into trouble for not working." She wanted Heathcliff to leave to avoid an encounter with his rival. "Send them away if they come. Tell them you are busy," he said. "Stay with me." He wanted more time with Catherine. Heathcliff showed her the calendar on the wall, where he had carefully marked the days with either crosses or circles. The crosses were the many evenings Catherine had spent with the Lintons, and the circles were the evenings she had spent with him. It was clear that Catherine was spending far more time with the Lintons than with Heathcliff. Catherine was annoyed and called Heathcliff ignorant and boring. It wasn't the response Heathcliff had hoped for, but Catherine was acting poorly and hurtfully. Heathcliff was very upset, but before he could say anything, Edgar arrived. Edgar looked very cheerful, and the difference between the two boys was clear for anyone to see, and Heathcliff quickly departed. Catherine tried to get me out of the room too, because she wanted to be alone with Edgar, but Hindley had ordered me to stay with Catherine if anyone came to visit. I said I had work to do in the room, but Catherine was still very angry and she pinched me so hard it hurt badly, and I screamed in pain. "You have no right to hurt me," I said. "I didn't touch you," she shouted. "You are lying." "What's this then?" I asked, showing the marks on my arm. Catherine was so angry that she slapped my face and continued acting irrationally. Little Hareton began to cry, and Catherine picked him up and shook him. Edgar tried to stop her, but Catherine slapped his ear with great strength, and he stepped back in astonishment. I took Hareton into the kitchen, but left the door open to make sure I kept my orders from Hindley. Edgar picked up his hat and started for the door, because he had no desire to stay at this point. Catherine ordered, "Don't go." "I must go," he said. "How can I stay? You hit me. You lied. I will never return." "You will be unhappy," she told him, "and I will cry." She sank down on her knees by a chair and began to weep loudly. Edgar started to leave, and I encouraged him to go. I said, "She is a bad girl. You'd better go home." He looked back at Catherine, and I could see that he was doomed. He didn't really desire to leave her at all, so he turned, went back to her, and closed the door. Later, I came in to tell them that the master had arrived home drunk and angry. I noticed their quarrel was over, and they were very close friends. They could not deny their friendship was changing into love. As soon as they heard that Hindley was home, Linton raced off on his horse, and Catherine went to her room. Because Hindley was uncontrollable when influenced by alcohol, I removed the bullets from the gun on the wall and hid Hareton in the kitchen to protect him from harm. Chapter 8. Catherine decides to marry. Hindley entered the house cursing and swearing loudly. He was so dreadfully mean when he had been drinking alcohol. A tyrant he was, and I found myself trying to protect Hareton by hiding him. But Hindley caught me sticking Hareton in the kitchen cupboard. Hareton was very frightened of his father and had no desire to be around him. Hindley forcefully dragged me away from the cupboard and threatened me. He swore he would kill me. He demanded, "Why are you hiding my son from me?" He threatened me by brandishing a kitchen knife, and although he held the knife to my face, I knew in my heart that he would not hurt me. I wasn't as afraid of his tyrannical fits as I probably should have been. He felt Hareton should run and greet him whenever he arrived home, so Hindley's tirade continued, and he threatened to cut off his son's ears unless Hareton kissed him. He picked Hareton up, carried him upstairs, and held him over the banister. The poor child was terrified, and I could hear him sobbing as he struggled to escape. I felt I should step in, so I told Hindley to stop being a fool. Both Hindley and I heard a footstep below us and halted our argument to see who had appeared. I saw that it was Heathcliff. At that moment, Hareton freed himself from his father's arms, but fell from the top of the stairs. Luckily, Heathcliff was beneath where Hareton fell, and seemingly without thinking, deftly caught him in his arms. Heathcliff saved Hareton's life that day. Then Heathcliff looked up to see why Hareton had fallen in such a manner. When he saw Hindley and realized Hareton's life had been endangered, he was dismayed, but not for your normal reasons. Heathcliff would much rather have allowed Hareton to break his neck, because that revenge would be so sweet, since Hindley would never have forgiven himself if something had happened to Hareton. However, it was too late. Hareton was safe, and I quickly picked him up and held him in my arms, as if I could keep him safe forever. Hindley slowly came down the stairs. The alcohol had worn off, and Hindley now seemed sober. Hindley placed the blame for the night's events on me. "It's your fault, Ellen," he said. "You should have hidden him from me. Is he hurt?" He tried to take Hareton from my arms, but Hareton screamed and would not go. He clung to me, which was no surprise, since he feared his father's temper. Hareton wanted nothing to do with his father, just as no one else wanted anything to do with him. I told Hindley, "This is a terrible family now." I spoke harshly. "Everybody hates you." Hindley warned us that we should stay away from him. He filled a glass with brandy and I tried to take it from him. I pleaded with him, I said, "Think of your son." He downed the alcohol regardless of my pleas and swore at us with brutal words that were too terrible to repeat. So I've blocked them from my memory. I took Hareton to the kitchen, and Heathcliff followed. I thought he went outside to go to work in the stable, but later discovered that he stayed there out of sight in the shadows and completely silent. He never announced his presence to me. I had Hareton on my knee and rocked him to sleep. The poor boy had suffered yet another ordeal at the hands of his father. Then Catherine entered. She asked, "Are you alone?" I replied yes. She wanted to know Heathcliff's whereabouts. I supplied the answer I believed to be true. In the stables looking after the ponies. During this time Heathcliff remained silent. Catherine was quiet for a minute, but then streams of tears fell from her eyes. She sobbed, "I am very unhappy." She begged me to keep a secret and told me that Edgar had proposed. He had asked her to marry him and she had agreed, but was unsure if she had made the right decision. I posed some questions and her answers were telling of her true feelings. I said, "Do you love him?" "Yes," she answered. I then asked, "Why?" "He is handsome and pleasant to be with," was her reply. I didn't believe this is a good foundation for marriage, so I said, "Not enough." "He is young and cheerful," she said. Catherine was leaving me unconvinced. I said, "Still not enough." She declared, "He loves me." "That's better," I said, "but it should have been the first thing you said." She added, "He will be wealthy and make me proud to have such a husband." I lashed out. "That is the worst reason of all, Catherine. Would you love him if he were ugly and poor?" Catherine hadn't changed much. Her response was typical. "No," she answered, "I would pity him." I asked Catherine, "You may meet richer men. Will you love them more?" Catherine answered, "I have not met them yet. I am dealing only in the present." "Then marry Edgar," I said, "since you are not thinking about the future." She asked, "Yes, but am I right?" "Of course," I replied. "Where is the problem?" "Here and here," she said, hitting her head and her heart dramatically. "They both tell me I am wrong." Then she told me about a dream she remembered, a dream that had tormented her. She dreamed she was in heaven, but it was not a happy place, because she could not consider heaven a home for the mere reason that Heathcliff was not there. Catherine said, "Because of Heathcliff, marrying Edgar is like that dream, and I can't marry Heathcliff because it would degrade me. He will never know that I love him. His soul and my soul are the same, while Edgar Linton's is different." I then became aware of Heathcliff's presence in the kitchen. I sensed movement, and I watched Heathcliff move and leave quietly. I tried to stop Catherine from speaking any further. I warned her that Joseph was nearby, and that perhaps Heathcliff was with him and heard some of what she said. She refused to heed my words, and she wouldn't stop talking. So she went on to say that she would never be separated from Heathcliff. In fact, she intended to use Edgar's money to come to Heathcliff's aid. By doing so, Heathcliff would then be able to escape from Hindley. She declared that this was the real reason for marrying Edgar, and asked me to promise to keep the secret, but I did not agree. Joseph entered then, and I had to prepare the evening meal. We didn't bring any food to Hindley because we were all quite afraid of him. We decided if he wanted any, he could ask for it, but we wouldn't serve it until requested. I had gone out to call Heathcliff, but could not find him since he disappeared earlier that day. I told Catherine that he had heard almost everything she said earlier. She jumped up and ran outside to search for him. She was gone for what seemed to be an interminably long time, but her efforts were in vain because she never did find him. She sent Joseph out to locate him, but his efforts yielded no results either. No one could find Heathcliff, and I believed him to be gone forever. It grew very dark and cloudy, and a terrible storm ensued that night, and the wind blew down a tree that crashed into the house. Such destruction! Catherine had stayed out in the rain looking for Heathcliff, and now was very wet from standing in the rain for such a length of time. Yet she never changed into warmer or drier clothing. The next morning Catherine was still wearing her wet clothes, and looked ill. Hindley addressed her. He wanted to know why she was soaked through and through, and why she was in such a state. "What is the matter with you?" she said. "I got wet and I'm cold, that's all." She said this in such a tone that it was evident she was upset. Hindley asked how she got wet, but it was Joseph who answered by telling Hindley about Edgar coming to visit and Catherine's frequent escapades out on the moors at night with Heathcliff. Hindley asked, "Did you see Heathcliff last night?" She hadn't found him, so she could reply honestly. "No," she replied, "I did not." She went to her room and began to weep and wail in earnest. We called the doctor, who came and treated her, but it took several weeks for her to get better again. Old Mrs. Linton came to visit her and took her back to Thrushcross Grange because she felt a cure would come quicker for Catherine if she were at the Grange instead of Wuthering Heights. It failed to be a good idea, though, because Catherine had been so ill. Both Mr. and Mrs. Linton fell ill while she was at Thrushcross Grange. They both died tragically of a fever within a few days of each other. Catherine returned to Wuthering Heights after their deaths, but Heathcliff had disappeared, and no one had seen or heard from him since the night of Edgar's marriage proposal to Catherine. 3 years had passed. Edgar and Catherine married, and they went to live at Thrushcross Grange. Hareton and I were very close, and although I did not like to leave Hareton alone with his father, I went with them. Catherine's tears were so much stronger than Hareton's. I am certain now that little Hareton bears no memories of Ellen Dean. So you see, sir, that's how I came to be here at Thrushcross Grange. Mrs. Dean looked at the clock. Several more hours had passed, and it was 1:30 in the morning, and she would stay no longer. It was for the best, since I was also tired and soon fell asleep. Chapter 9. Heathcliff Returns. My long walk through the storm caused me great sickness, and I was confined to bed for 4 weeks. Dr. Kenneth says I should expect to remain indoors until spring, and that I won't be completely well until then. Mr. Heathcliff sent me some food a week ago, and also visited me. It is he that I blame for my illness. I requested Mrs. Dean to come and sit with me and finish her story. Tell me what happened to Heathcliff, I asked. Did he get a scholarship and go to college? Or did he earn money in America or Europe? Perhaps he became a highway robber. I don't know how he got his education or his money, claimed Mrs. Dean, but I will continue my story if you find it amusing. I came to Thrushcross Grange upon Catherine's betrothal to Edgar. She behaved much better than I expected. She liked Edgar and Isabella, and the feelings were mutual. Edgar was afraid of upsetting Catherine, and often spoke to me if Catherine was unhappy with my work. For half a year they were an amazingly happy couple. Then it suddenly ended. One evening I was bringing a basket of apples inside, when Heathcliff came out of the shadows near the house. At first I did not recognize him, but then I saw his eyes, and there was no mistaking that those were Heathcliff's eyes. I would like to speak to Catherine, he said. Tell her that someone from the village wishes to speak to her. I began to inquire about his life, but he interrupted my questioning and grew forceful. He demanded impatiently, "Go and give my message to Catherine." I delivered the message to Catherine, and she went to see who it was. Edgar asked me who it was, and I told him it was Heathcliff. Catherine came running up the stairs. She was very excited. "Heathcliff is back," she told her husband joyfully. Edgar, however, was less excited at the thought of Heathcliff's return. "I know you didn't like him," she said, "but you must try to be friends. Shall I bring him up?" Edgar suggested that Heathcliff sit in the kitchen, but Catherine refused. Edgar acquiesced and asked me to bring Heathcliff up, and pleaded with Catherine to be calm. He said, "Don't treat a servant who ran away as if he were a brother." When Heathcliff entered the room, we were surprised to see how much taller, stronger, and older he looked. Catherine could not stop looking at him, and when he looked at her, you could see they were very happy to see each other again. Their joy at being reunited could not be masked. Unfortunately, Edgar was annoyed and uncomfortable. "I can't believe it," exclaimed Catherine. "It's like a dream. You don't deserve this welcome, though. You were away 3 years and never thought of me." "I thought of you more than you thought of me," he replied. "When I heard of your marriage, I decided to come and see you, then take my revenge on Hindley and kill myself. But your welcome has changed my mind." As Heathcliff was leaving, I asked him where he was going to sleep, and he told me that Hindley invited him to stay at Wuthering Heights with him. I wondered what evil he intended to do. Perhaps he should not have returned. In the middle of the night, Catherine woke me and said she wanted to talk to me. "Edgar is angry because I am happy," she complained. "He should be happy for me. Heathcliff is a gentleman now, and Edgar should accept him." Catherine told me that Heathcliff was planning to stay at Wuthering Heights. He first went there to see Catherine, but Joseph had told Hindley that Heathcliff was looking for me. Hindley came out to talk to him and invited him to come into the house. There were some men playing cards. Heathcliff joined them and won some money from Hindley. Hindley invited him to come again. "Heathcliff intends to pay well for his accommodation," she said. I asked, "Aren't you worried about him staying there with your brother?" "Not for Heathcliff," she replied, "and I'm sure that he won't hurt my brother if I ask him." Catherine returned to bed as a happy woman. Heathcliff came to visit the Grange several times, and Edgar maintained an outward appearance of friendliness and politeness. Catherine, of course, remained ecstatic. Then a new problem arose. Isabella, Edgar's sister, was 18 years old and fell desperately in love with Heathcliff. Edgar was truly horrified and instantly blamed Heathcliff. But it was clear that Heathcliff was completely innocent. Isabella was intensely angry with Catherine and told her that she loved Heathcliff more than Catherine loved Edgar, and was sure that Heathcliff would love her if Catherine allowed it. Catherine told her that Heathcliff was not a kind man, but was actually fierce and cruel. Catherine warned Isabella, "He will marry you for your money." Isabella wanted to hear nothing of the kind, and chose to not believe anything. Catherine proclaimed about Heathcliff. After Catherine left the room, Isabella asked me if I agreed with Catherine. "Don't think about marrying him," I said. "He's not a good man. No one knows him better than Catherine. Honest men do not have to hide their lives. How did he get his money? Why is he staying at Wuthering Heights with a man he hates? Joseph told me they drink and play cards all night. Is this the kind of man you want to marry?" I believe Isabella truly loved him, for she said she would not listen to me and left. The next day Edgar departed for the village in the early hours, and Heathcliff visited Thrushcross Grange, where Catherine and Isabella were still angry with each other. Catherine revealed to Heathcliff that Isabella loved him. This revelation was complete embarrassment to Isabella, and she fled the room as soon as she could. Heathcliff thought Catherine was joking, but she insisted she was not. Heathcliff said some terrible things about Isabella, which made it clear that he had no interest in her. He thought for a moment, and then he said, "But she would inherit Thrushcross Grange if Edgar died, wouldn't she?" "Edgar will have sons from me before then," replied Catherine. "It's no use to marry her for that reason." There were times after that episode when I would see Heathcliff smiling to himself whenever he saw Isabella, and I wondered why. Chapter 10. A Kiss and a Fight. Mrs. Dean was about to continue, but reflected for a moment. I often wondered how things were at Wuthering Heights, and I suppose since I had spent so many years there that I was curious. Sometimes I walked there to look at the heights from a distance, but I didn't dare enter or speak with Hindley. One day I was near the house when I saw Hareton. 10 months had passed since I left him, and I felt as though he were my child. He hadn't changed that much physically. I called out to him, but he started to retreat from me, but not before he picked up a stone, as if to throw it at me to prevent my intrusion. "I've come to see your father, Hareton," I said. He threw the stone at me, and I tried to calm him with words, but I could not. He threw the stone with good aim and hit my bonnet. Then he began to swear viciously at me, and this caused me to be very upset, because it made me so terribly sad to see him acting like his father. I took an orange from my pocket and offered it to him as an appeal for peace. He looked at it for a moment and then snatched it from me. I offered him another one, but wouldn't allow him to accept it until I had asked him some questions. I discovered that Heathcliff encouraged him to swear at his father and prevented him from getting any school lessons. I grieved for what poor Hareton had become at the hands of Heathcliff. I gave him the orange and asked him to tell his father that I wanted to speak to him. He went inside, but Heathcliff came to the door, so I fled down the road as fast as my legs would carry me, without stopping once. I was now determined to stop Isabella from marrying Heathcliff. The next time Heathcliff came to visit Thrushcross Grange, I saw him kiss Isabella in the garden. Isabella did not want to kiss him, but he forced her. I told Catherine, and when Heathcliff came in, she reminded him to leave Isabella alone, or Edgar would bar him from the house. Heathcliff was unbelievably rude, and he said it was not Catherine's business if he chose to kiss Isabella. He continued his angry stream of words, and said he knew how badly Catherine had treated him, and how much he hated her behavior. Heathcliff vowed revenge, just as he sought revenge on everyone, it seemed. "Thank you for telling me Isabella's secret," he continued. "I will make good use of it, you can be sure." "You are only happy if you make other people unhappy," said Catherine. "If you make Edgar and his sister unhappy, you are also making me unhappy." Catherine was quite exhausted after the exchange of words, so she sat by the fire, and I saw her face flushed and her moods depressed. I went upstairs where Edgar was waiting for Catherine, and wondering why she was away so long. I described what had transpired, and he was furious. He blamed Catherine for allowing Heathcliff to visit the house, so he headed downstairs in a fit of anger. Before he left, he ordered me to call 2 men from the fields. When we entered the kitchen, Catherine and Heathcliff were still arguing viciously. Edgar was angry with Catherine, and she was accusing him of eavesdropping at the door. Edgar told Heathcliff to leave immediately and never return to Thrushcross Grange. But Heathcliff laughed at him. Edgar signaled me to call the 2 men, but Catherine followed me. When she saw the two men, she locked the door to keep them out and told her husband that he should fight Heathcliff himself. Catherine didn't think Edgar should be mad at her because she felt she hadn't done anything wrong. Edgar would not exonerate Catherine of blame, though, since he felt her friendship with Heathcliff was forcing him to be nice, and he shouldn't have to be nice to such a lowly person as Heathcliff. "I was protecting Isabella," she said to her husband, "and you are angry at me. I hope Heathcliff beats you." Edgar tried to snatch the key from her, but she threw it into the fire. He leaned on the back of a chair and covered his face with his hands. He felt so weak he trembled, and his skin lost all color, and he was pale beyond belief. He felt humiliated and covered his face with his hands. "You are a weak fool," Catherine told him. "Heathcliff won't hurt you. He wouldn't fight such a weak person." "Look, Catherine," said Heathcliff, "this is the weak fool you preferred to me. I hope you are happy together." He pushed the chair. He wanted to beat Edgar, but refrained, because Edgar was such a weak individual. At that moment, Edgar jumped up and struck Heathcliff so hard on the throat that he could hardly breathe. Edgar retreated and he walked out the back door. "You'd better go," said Catherine. "If he overheard us at the door, he will never forgive you. You have played a mean trick, Heathcliff." "I will not go with that blow still burning on my throat," shouted Heathcliff. "I will knock him down now or murder him later." I needed to step in. "He is not coming," I said. "He is sending 3 men with clubs to put you out of the house." Heathcliff decided to leave, but not before he smashed the door lock with a poker and departed. I went upstairs with Catherine, who told me to tell Edgar that she was ill. She did not know that I had told him about the kiss, and I didn't want her to know. "Tell Edgar that I am very sick," she said. "Why did he listen at the door? If he hadn't listened, there would have been no trouble. I want to frighten him. If Heathcliff cannot be my friend, I will break their hearts by breaking my own. Please, go now and tell him how sick I am." I met Edgar going toward the room, but didn't tell him what Catherine had said. I knew that Catherine was not really sick at all, and I didn't want to frighten him and encourage her selfishness. I stayed listening at the door. Edgar demanded that Catherine choose between Heathcliff and himself. She could only have one. Friendship with Heathcliff would be impossible, as long as she was married to him. Catherine in turn demanded that he leave her alone, because she was ill. She told Edgar she could barely stand, and then she rang the bell for me to enter. She was knocking her head against the arm of the sofa and grinding her teeth. Edgar was worried and told me to get some water. I brought some, but she would not drink, so I sprinkled some on her face. She stretched out on the sofa and made herself stiff, and rolled her eyes to the back of her head. Edgar was absolutely terrified. I whispered, "There is nothing wrong with her." I told him Catherine intended to frighten him. I certainly didn't want him to yield to her while she was acting so horribly, but unfortunately she hurt me. She suddenly sat up, her eyes flashed viciously, and she rushed out of the room. I followed her to her own room, but she locked the door and would not allow me in. The next day she stayed in her room. She refused to eat at breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Edgar retired to the library and did not ask about his wife. He spoke to Isabella and warned her that she was not to see Heathcliff again. Chapter 11. Bad News at Thrushcross Grange. Mrs. Dean continued her story. The situation at Thrushcross Grange was not the least bit pleasant. Isabella wandered around in the garden dreadfully silent, and often crying while her brother shut himself in the library, hoping perhaps that his wife would beg for his forgiveness. Meanwhile, Catherine remained shut away in her room, hoping perhaps that her husband would choke to death because he was so unhappy without her. I continued with my household duties, and I have no doubt that I was the only sane person at Thrushcross Grange. On the 3rd day after the events, Catherine unlocked her door because she had drunk the water from the pitcher she kept, and asked for some water and some soup. She claimed she was dying, and although I didn't believe this to be true, I brought her some tea and dry toast, which she devoured hungrily and eagerly. She said dramatically, I will die because nobody cares about me, and now I wish I had not eaten that toast." Then a moment later she said strongly, "No, I will not die because that would only please him, and I don't want to please him since he doesn't love me at all." I remained composed while Catherine went on in her exaggerated manner, and eventually she asked what Edgar was doing. I replied, "He is well, but he is always with his books because he has no other company." This information upset Catherine, for she could not believe that he was not more upset about her potential death, and questioned his loyalty since it seemed he preferred his books to her. "With his books," she exclaimed, "and I am dying. Tell him that I am dying." I explained, "He will not believe it." She demanded I lie. She said, "Tell him that you think so." "But I do not think so," I insisted. I couldn't lie to her. Since she had eaten with such zest, the effects of food and liquid would make her all the better by morning. "You have eaten and taken some tea this evening, so by tomorrow you will feel better." "You don't know how I suffer," she groaned. She complained about her state and how she could not sleep. Catherine then started to bemoan how no one seemed to like her, and was utterly shocked at the thought that although everybody hated each other, they were still able to love her. She said, "Why don't you like me, Nellie? I thought everyone liked me. Why don't Isabella and Edgar like me? When I am dead, he will be glad and go back to his books." She despised the books and the fact that Edgar loved them more than he seemed to love her. Catherine acted fitfully. She shook her head from side to side and tore the pillow with her teeth as if she were a wild animal. She asked me to open the window even though it was snowing outside, but I didn't want to do this, so I resisted. I was not going to let the wind in and be the reason she caught a very bad cold. Then she pulled the feathers out of the pillow that she had ripped apart and put them on her bed while she attempted to name all the different birds that had shed those feathers. "Look at this one," she said. "It's from a lapwing, my favorite bird. Did they shoot my lapwing, Nellie?" She began to weep. I reprimanded her. "Stop this nonsense." The feathers were flying about the room much like snow falling from heavy winter clouds. I started picking up all the feathers. Then she saw her reflection in the mirror, but she would not believe it was her image staring back. She thought it was a ghost and acted very frightened. In fact, she said she was afraid to be alone in the room and forbade me to leave. I held her hand and tried to calm her to no avail, especially since I didn't know if she were speaking in her sleep. I told her, "There is nobody there, and it is only yourself in the mirror." She covered her eyes with her clothes and I tried to escape from the room, but she saw me and screamed. "I thought I was in my bed at Wuthering Heights," she said. "Please stay with me because I am afraid of my dreams. How long have I been here?" I explained, "You came into the room on Monday and now it is Thursday night." "The same week?" she asked incredulously. "It feels much longer. I wish I could be a little girl again and play with Heathcliff on the moors. Open the window, Nellie, and let me feel the air." I refused. "I don't want to be responsible for making you cold and perhaps killing you." Catherine declared she was not helpless, so she got out of the bed and flung open the window herself, and she didn't seem to notice the cold air on her shoulders as she stared out of the window. She thought she could see Wuthering Heights and Heathcliff. She said, "I want to go home." Edgar was passing by the room and heard us speaking. He entered only to be shocked at Catherine's appearance. He held her in his arms, even though she did not recognize him at first. When she did notice it was Edgar cradling her, she lashed out at him angrily. "You are here. You can never be found when you are wanted, but always come when you are not. You will not stop me from going to my home. I do not want you, Edgar. I do not want you." Edgar was very upset, and he blamed me for not telling him about her condition. I kept saying that she was only fretting, but he was angered and felt I should have told her about her condition, and insisted that I keep him better informed. We argued about Heathcliff's visit when he kissed Isabella, and Edgar insisted that I not have told him about it. Things escalated because Catherine was furious when she heard this and realized that I had told Edgar about Heathcliff's kiss. She tried to escape from Edgar's arms and hurt me, but I ran from the room with the intent of going to the village to find the doctor. As I walked to the village, I noticed Isabella's pet dog tied to a tree, and briefly wondered how it got there, because I remembered that Isabella took it to her room when she went to bed that evening. I heard some horses galloping in the distance, But I thought no more about what that could have meant, because I was focused now, since the care of Dr. Kenneth was a priority. When I found him, he came with me immediately, and as we walked back to Thrushcross Grange, I described how Catherine's illness began with a quarrel about Heathcliff. Dr. Kenneth told me that somebody saw Heathcliff and Isabella out at night, and that Heathcliff had urged Isabella to get on her horse and ride away with him. She refused but promised to be ready next time. This news concerned me, so I ran ahead of Dr. Kenneth, and I got back to the Grange and went up to Isabella's room. She was not there, and I wasn't sure what actions I should take, since Edgar and Catherine were too busy with their own problems. If I told them this, it would make everything worse. I decided not to say anything yet. When Dr. Kenneth arrived, he examined Catherine and told us not to worry, because Catherine would recover if we kept her quiet. That night we were sleepless except Isabella, from whom we heard no sound that entire evening. Catherine and Edgar commented on how well she slept. Early the next morning, one of the maids went to the village. She hurried back and rushed into the room to tell the news that Isabella had been taken away by Heathcliff. She heard the news in the village that Heathcliff and Isabella were seen during the night when they stopped at a blacksmith to shoe a horse. Edgar refused to believe it and asked me to go and look in her room. I did as I was told but had to come back and confirm that Isabella was not there. "What should we do?" I asked. "Should we chase them?" "No," said Edgar. "She decided to go. Let her go. She is no longer my sister." Chapter 12. A Letter from Isabella. Heathcliff and Isabella were considered fugitives and remained absent for 2 months, and during that time Catherine fell seriously ill. The doctor did not offer much hope of recovery from Catherine's bout with brain fever, but Edgar nursed her very carefully. He sat devotedly beside her bed and did everything he could to satisfy her needs. Dr. Kenneth said she might live, but her mind might not return. Edgar sacrificed his own health and strength to care for her, and no one was more joyful than he when her life was declared out of danger, even though her mind might never be the same. The first time she left her room was a happy occasion, and Edgar had put some flowers on her pillow so that she saw them as soon as she awoke. She realized they were the earliest flowers of spring, crocuses, the same as these at Wuthering Heights. Edgar described how beautiful the hills and the streams were after the snow and how fresh the air was at this time of the year. In fact, nearly all the snow was gone, and Edgar said that one day he would take her on to the hills and she would remain there forever. She began to cry and the tears ran down her cheeks because she was saddened and wanted Edgar to remember how happy he was to have her under his roof this day. Edgar did what he could to make her more cheerful, so he tried little things like moving her into a different room. We hoped these changes would aid in her recovery, especially when we discovered that she and Edgar were going to be parents soon. Although Heathcliff and Isabella had been gone for 2 months, Isabella did make contact with Edgar after 6 weeks. After Heathcliff and Isabella left, Isabella sent her brother a note about her marriage to Heathcliff, but I don't think he replied. It seemed cold and harsh, but to her credit there was a short apology, an entreaty for reconciliation, because she really didn't want to lose her brother over this marriage. 2 weeks later I received a long letter from her, and I've kept it all these years. The letter read like this: "Dear Ellen, last night I came to Wuthering Heights and heard that Catherine was very ill. I fear I should not write to her while she suffers this illness, and my brother will not answer my letters, because I am sure he's still angry and upset over my leaving, so I must write to you. Please tell Edgar that I miss him, and let him know I am sorry I left Thrushcross Grange, for my heart returned there soon after I left, but I cannot return in person. I have 2 questions to ask you, and I implore answers from you. First, how did you remain sane in the house? Second, is Heathcliff mad or a devil? Please come and see me and bring me something from Edgar. I desire to hear from my brother. I'll tell you how I was received in my new home at Wuthering Heights. It was dark when we arrived, and old Joseph came out to greet us. It was a poor greeting as he held his torch in my face and scowled at me. He took the horses away, and Heathcliff stayed to talk to him, so I went into the kitchen. There I saw Hareton and tried to be friendly to him, for he is Catherine's nephew, but he would not let me touch him. Although I could barely understand his language, it was clear he swore at me and threatened to make the dog attack me. I went back outside, but could not see Heathcliff anywhere. I found Joseph and asked him to take me inside, but he refused because he claimed he had something to do. Joseph carried on with his work and made it clear that he held nothing but contempt for me. I found another door and knocked on it in sincere hope that a more civil servant would greet me, but I was disappointed when it was opened by a tall, unhappy man who dressed badly and allowed his hair to hang over his shoulders. "What do you want? Who are you?" he demanded. I told him who I was, that I was Heathcliff's wife, and I supposed he had permission to bring me to Wuthering Heights. "Is Heathcliff back then?" he asked. "Yes, we have just arrived," I replied. I told him about my attempt to enter the kitchen, but he was not interested. Instead, he kept looking past me for Heathcliff and began to curse him, and I wanted to leave, but he closed the door. I asked if I could call a maid because I wanted someone to show me where my room was. But this man would only walk up and down the room, muttering and cursing, and I didn't dare ask him again. It was terrible to sit there and remember that Thrushcross Grange was only 4 miles away, but I could not go there. I realized the man was Hindley Earnshaw. Hindley continued to walk up and down for over an hour while I sat quietly in the room, and he seemingly forgot I was there. I sighed loudly and he hurt me, so I took the opportunity to ask again for a maid. "We have none," he replied. "You will have to serve yourself." I told him that I was tired and wanted to go to bed. "Ask Joseph to show you Heathcliff's room," he said. Then he encouraged me to make sure I locked the door with a heavy bolt, because every night he walked past the door and tried to open it so that he could kill Heathcliff. I was very surprised at first when he showed me the knife he would use, and I thought how good it would be to have one, so I would be very powerful. I queried, "If you hate Heathcliff so much, why don't you ask him to leave the house?" "He must not," said Hindley, and he swore and cursed again. "I will have it back, and I want his money too." He began to pace the length of the room again, so I went into the kitchen to find Joseph. He was busy making porridge, but I took it from him and made it myself, and this action upset Joseph for some reason. Then he got milk from the dairy, and Hareton drank from the jug. The boy ate and drank like an animal. I got some fresh milk and decided to eat upstairs, so I asked Joseph to give me a room, and although he grumbled and complained, he got up and took me to a room at the top of the house. However, this was not a bedroom. I demanded, "Where is Heathcliff's room?" He answered, "It's locked." He took me to yet another room which was large. Unfortunately, the carpet was covered in dust, and the furniture and walls were old and damaged. "This is the master's room," said the foolish servant. I was angry now, but he told me there were no other rooms to see. With this news I sat down on the stairs and cried while Joseph went back downstairs with a light and left me in the dark. Hindley came up to his room, but he did not see me, and then Joseph came back and told me I could stay by the fire in the main room. I went back downstairs and threw myself into a chair and was soon asleep. I was woken by Heathcliff shaking my shoulder and asking why I was sleeping there. So I told him that I could not enter our room because he had the key in his pocket. He told me it was not our room but his, and he swore at me. He told me that Catherine was ill and blamed my brother. He said that since he could not punish Edgar, he would punish me. I hate him and I should not have married him. Please come and see me soon. Isabella. Chapter 13. Heathcliff visits Thrushcross Grange. The moment I read this letter, I mentioned to Edgar that his sister now inhabited Wuthering Heights and wanted desperately to see Catherine and him. Edgar refused to schedule a visit to see Isabella, however, and suggested she should convince Heathcliff to leave the country. He refused forgiveness and swore no communication between them should exist. He would not even write her a note, but he did allow me to visit Wuthering Heights that afternoon. Isabella must have been anxious for my arrival, for I saw her peering from the window as I walked over. When I arrived, I found the house in a terrible mess. It did not look as though Isabella had even swept or cleaned. It was as if she had succumbed to the dismal state of affairs and felt she needn't bother with such trivial household chores. Hindley was not there, but Heathcliff sat at the table perusing some papers, and he immediately greeted me and offered me a chair. He definitely looked like a gentleman. In fact, he was the best thing in the home. His poor wife did not look like a lady since her hair was awful, and her dress was old. Sadly, Isabella did not seem to care about her appearance or fashion. She came to greet me holding out her hand for the letter she expected, and it saddened me to inform her that Edgar did not send a note. Heathcliff asked questions about Catherine, and I described her illness and blamed her for bringing it on herself. I explained to Heathcliff that her life had been spared, but Catherine will never be the woman she had once been. I suggested, I hope you will avoid meeting her so that she does not fall ill again. Another meeting between you and Edgar could prove fatal for her. Heathcliff refused my request immediately and proclaimed that it was impossible for him to stay away from Catherine. He declared, Edgar is a weak man and he can never love Catherine as I love her. If he loved her, he would desire her happiness, and if he wanted her to be happy, he would allow me to visit her. Catherine and Edgar love each other as much as any two people can, cried Isabella. Don't insult my brother. He loves you too, doesn't he? Replied Heathcliff with venom in his voice. He has abandoned you very quickly. He was quick to hurl the insult toward Isabella. Isabella replied, He doesn't know what I suffer. I mentioned to Heathcliff he should care for his wife, and remember that she was a lady, but he voiced his opinions of Isabella, and replied that he did not love her, and thought she was a silly girl for loving him. In fact, he hoped that he would soon accomplish the great task of stopping her from loving him, and thought he had made good progress already. He said, I enjoy making her suffer. She is a nuisance and can go if she wants to. You are mad, I told him. Then I turned to Isabella and said, Come, Isabella, do not stay with him. Be careful, Ellen, she said. Do not trust what he says, because he told me that before, and I tried to leave to no avail, so I dare not try again. My only hope is to die or to see him dead. Isabella spoke with a serious voice, and told me Heathcliff was a liar, a monster. Heathcliff ordered her to go upstairs, because he said he wanted to talk to me in private. When she had gone, I put on my bonnet so I could leave, but he ordered me to take off my bonnet and forced me to stay. He sought my help in seeing Catherine, but I refused even after he threatened me by locking the doors, as if holding me captive and saying I could not depart from Wuthering Heights. After arguing and complaining, and refusing 50 times, he forced me to take a letter from him to Catherine, and he unwillingly made me agree to tell him when Edgar was next away. It was probably the wrong thing to do, but the circumstances left me with no choice, so I surrendered and left with the letter in hand. That evening, I knew that Heathcliff was outside, although I did not see him. I didn't dare leave the confines of the house, because I was certain that he would threaten me again. I decided not to give Catherine the letter until Edgar was out, since I did not know how it would affect her. 4 days later, on Sunday, the family went to church and left Catherine in my care, with only a manservant staying there with us. We rarely left the doors open, but it was a beautiful morning, so we opened the doors wide to let the healthy air into the house. I told the manservant that the mistress wanted to eat some oranges, and he must go to the village and buy some for her. After he left, I went upstairs because I knew I must give Catherine the letter, and I sensed Heathcliff would be coming. Catherine was wearing a loose white dress with a shawl over it, for warmth as she sat near an open window. Her skin was pale and her hair was cut short, which changed her appearance drastically. I had conveyed these changes to Heathcliff. I had told him her eyes no longer flashed, but gazed serenely into the distance, almost as if in a dream. A book lay open in front of her, where Edgar had left it after reading to her. He often read to her, though she never listened, in hopes of engaging her in an activity she used to enjoy. Sometimes she pushed him angrily away, and he recognized that as a signal to leave her alone. I approached her and put the letter in her hand. I said, "Please read it now, because it needs a reply." Catherine instead let it fall through her limp fingers. I asked, "Shall I read it for you? It's from Heathcliff." This news startled her, and she looked at the letter and sighed. I offered to unseal it, and she acquiesced. She glanced at the letter but seemed not to understand it, so I interpreted for her. I said, "He wants to see you." As I spoke, I glanced out the window and saw Heathcliff approaching the house, and he'd be there momentarily. In only a short time he had entered, and was at Catherine's side. He took hold of her in his arms, and held her for 5 minutes without speaking. He could see that she would not live, and was truly heartbroken. The two posed together made a strange picture, and I remember it vividly, because it was something I never thought I would see. He groaned, "Catherine, Catherine, I cannot bear it." Catherine announced, "You and Edgar have broken my heart, and yet you both come to me looking for pity. I refuse to give it, because you have killed me and grown strong. How long will you live after I am dead?" Heathcliff wanted to embrace her again, but she continued, "I wish I could hold you until we were both dead. I don't care what you suffer, because I suffer and you should suffer too. Will you forget me when I am dead, or will you tell people that you loved me once but it is past? Will you say that when you die, you'll be sorry to leave your children more than you are glad that you are coming to me?" "Don't torture me," he exclaimed. "Why talk to me like that when you are dying? You know I will never forget those words, but instead I will have to live with them forever. You know that I did not kill you, and you know that I can never forget you. When you die, you will be at peace, but I shall be in torment." She murmured, "I will not be at peace, because you will not be there. You will not be there." She tried to stand by leaning on the arm of the chair. They held each other tight, while they were both in tears and their voices so earnest. "Why did you despise me?" he asked. "Why did you betray your own heart? You have killed yourself by loving me, and you know you should not have married Edgar. I have not broken your heart, but you have broken it yourself, and so have broken mine." "Don't be angry," sobbed Catherine. "If I have done wrong, I am dying for it." She begged him, "You left me too, and I forgive you. Please, forgive me." He replied, "I cannot. I forgive what you have done to me, but I cannot forgive what you have done to yourself." I interrupted because I had to warn them that Edgar would soon be home. Heathcliff held her closer. Even as I told them, I saw Edgar come in the gate, walking slowly in the summer sun. "He is here," I said. "Please, get out of the house before he comes inside." "I must go, Catherine," said Heathcliff, but she held him and would not let him go. She began to scream, "Don't go! Don't go, I will die!" Immediately afterwards, Catherine's arms had fallen to her sides. Her head was hanging lower as if she had fainted. I was relieved, since she would have to suffer more if Edgar came inside. Edgar heard the screams and hurried up the stairs. He came into the room and saw Heathcliff still embracing Catherine, who was limp. Heathcliff said, "Help her first, then we will speak." Edgar and I looked after Catherine until she revived. She was bewildered and knew nobody. Heathcliff went to sit in another room, and I convinced him to leave the house. "I will be back tomorrow," he promised before he left. Chapter 14. Life and Death at Thrushcross Grange. At 12 o'clock that night, Catherine Linton, the girl you met during your fateful night at Wuthering Heights, was born at Thrushcross Grange. She was 2 months early and never knew her mother, for Catherine died only 2 hours later. Catherine lay in perfect calm and peace, having never regained the consciousness to recall Heathcliff or Edgar. I was pleased for her, because her suffering was over and her soul was in heaven. But Edgar grieved terribly. I had never seen a man so stricken with sorrow. The next morning he lay asleep and looked exhausted, and I went outside to find Heathcliff, because I knew he would be there waiting to come back in. I wanted to find him but was also afraid. How would he receive the news of Catherine's death? I longed for this terrible deed to be over, yet I didn't want to start because I didn't know how to tell him. I found him leaning against a tree in the park. His hair was soaked with the dew dripping from the branches above him, and I noticed it because he wore no hat. He must have been there for a lengthy time, for the animals moved closely to him, as if he were a tree rather than a human they should fear. As soon as I saw him, I knew that he already knew about Catherine's death. "She's dead," he said. "I didn't wait for you to find that out. Stop your crying. Catherine doesn't want your tears." He lashed out these words with viciousness. What he didn't know was that I wept as much for him as I did for her, because I think people pity those who have no feelings for themselves or for others, and Heathcliff was like that. He asked me to describe the last moments of her life, and I could see he was nervous. He wanted to know if she had died like a saint, and at that moment, I realized that he had a heart, just like other men, only he did not want others to know it. I told him how quietly she died, by simply sinking into sleep. I mentioned that a mere 5 minutes after that, I felt a small pulse at her heart, and then nothing more. "Did she mention me?" Heathcliff hated to ask, because he dreaded the answer and wasn't sure he'd be able to bear the details he would be told. I told him that she didn't wake from the time he left the house to the time of her death. She never returned to a conscious state, and I explained that I expect her to wake in another world. I said, "She looked very peaceful." He screamed angrily, "I hope she is in torment." He called out to her, "You said I killed you. Haunt me then. Murdered people often haunt their murderers, so haunt me. I cannot live without my soul." He spoke with great passion and stomped his foot vehemently. He hit his head against the tree and left blood from his wounds, and although I grew frightened, I was also quite afraid to leave. He looked at me like a wild animal and demanded I leave. I realized he was beyond anything I could do to console his tortured heart, so I left. Until the funeral on Thursday, the body lay in a room at Thrushcross Grange covered with flowers and scented leaves. Edgar was there all day and all night, never sleeping, as he served as a guardian of sorts over her body. Heathcliff was outside among the trees, never sleeping either. I didn't speak to Heathcliff, but I knew he would like to enter the house and see Catherine's body. On Tuesday, when Edgar was so tired that he had to sleep for a few hours, I opened the window to allow Heathcliff the chance to say a final goodbye. I noticed later that he came in, and while there, he had removed Edgar's hair from a locket that Catherine wore around her neck. In its place, he placed a lock of his own black hair and threw Edgar's hair on the floor. I picked up Edgar's hair and put it back in the locket with Heathcliff's. Hindley Arnshaw was invited to the funeral, but did not come, and Isabella was not invited, so the funeral was a very small event. Catherine was buried in a corner of the churchyard. Her husband lies there too now. Chapter 15. Isabella escapes from Wuthering Heights. The days after the funeral were not at all pleasant, because it rained and snowed, and a cold wind blew, indicating that summer was indeed over. One evening, Edgar had retired to his bedroom, and I sat looking after the baby. Suddenly, someone rushed into the room, out of breath and laughing. I could not see who it was, and thought perhaps it was one of the maids. I ordered, "Stop your silly behavior immediately. What would the master say if he heard you?" "I'm sorry," said a familiar voice. "I know Edgar is asleep, but I cannot stop myself." She came to the fire, still trying to catch her breath. She continued, "I ran all the way from Wuthering Heights, and I kept falling down, and I'm sore all over. I'll explain what happened, but please order a carriage for me to go to the village, and tell a servant to get some of my clothes ready." It was Isabella, although she was hard to recognize. Her hair was loose and dripped with freezing water, her dress was wet, and she was barefoot. She suffered a deep cut under one ear, scratches all over her pale face, and bruises lining her arms and legs. I responded, "I won't do anything until you change into dry clothes. You will not go to the village tonight, so there is no need to order a carriage." She replied, "I will go to the village, even if I have to walk. However, I will put on some dry clothes." She ordered me again to arrange the carriage and asked a maid to get some of her clothes before she would let me help her. I stopped the bleeding from her cut and helped her put on dry clothes. The baby cried, and this upset her, so I asked a maid to take the baby away and look after her. Isabella began to say how she grieved for Catherine, and then she took off her wedding ring and threw it in the fire, as she told me that she would not wear it. She said, "I had to come here, and I only hope that Heathcliff will not come after me to bring me back. He was so angry, and I wish Hindley was strong enough to kill him." I asked, "What happened? Why did you escape from Wuthering Heights, and where will you go if you do not stay with us?" Isabella answered, "I would like to stay with you to look after Edgar and the baby, but it is impossible because Heathcliff will not allow it. He would make sure we are unhappy since he despises me. I can see the hatred he has for me in his face every time I go near him. I don't love him now, and I'm quite pleased that he hates me. I wish he would kill himself, and I wish I had never met him." I told her, "You should be kinder because he is a human being, and there are people worse than him." Isabella denied my statement. She claimed, "He is not human. I gave him my heart, but he broke it and threw it back at me, so I have no feelings for him. He can cry tears of blood for Catherine, but he will never get my pity." With that declaration, she began to cry, but stopped almost immediately. Isabella shared, "I'll tell you what happened. Yesterday, Hindley should have been at the funeral, because he kept himself sober the previous night, but woke unhappy that morning and began to drink brandy, so he didn't go to the funeral. Heathcliff has not eaten a meal with us for a week. He would come home and lock himself in his room, where we could hear him swear and groan. When he came out of his room, he would immediately go back to the Grange. Although I was sorry that Catherine was dead, I was secretly pleased Heathcliff was absent. Yesterday evening I sat by the fire reading a book, and Hindley was there too, but quieter than usual. Perhaps he was thinking about the sad events of the last 6 or 7 days as I was. We didn't speak for 2 or 3 hours. In fact, there was no sound except the rattling of the windows in the wind and the crackle of the fire. We heard Heathcliff arrive home and try to open the kitchen door, but it was locked. He went to the other door, and I know Hindley saw that I was frightened. He said, "I'll keep him out another 5 minutes. Will you object?" I replied, "No, you can keep him out all night if you like. Lock the door." He did this before Heathcliff got to the door, and then came and sat close to me. Hindley then said, "We are both cowards. Are you like your brother? Will you allow him to treat you badly and never take your revenge?" I told him I would be glad to take revenge, if I could find a way to do it without hurting myself. Violence is like a spear with points at both ends, and usually hurts those who use it more than those they use it against. Hindley did not agree, and asked me only to sit still and say nothing, and he would kill Heathcliff with his knife. He removed it from his pocket. "No," I said, "you must not kill him. Keep the door locked and be quiet." Nothing I could do would persuade him, for he was determined to do it. He said he didn't care for his own life, so he would kill Heathcliff and then kill himself, and I would be free. I could not argue with him, so I ran to the window and shouted at Heathcliff that he should go somewhere else because Hindley was determined to kill him. Heathcliff swore at me and told me to open the door, but I refused. I sat down by the fire, and Hindley swore at me now for warning Heathcliff of the danger. Heathcliff broke a window and stuck his ugly face into the room. His hair and clothes were white with snow, and his sharp teeth shone through the dark. The window frame was too narrow to allow his shoulders through, so I smiled at him because I knew I was safe. Heathcliff said, "Let me in, Isabella, or you will be sorry." "I can't," I replied. "Hindley is here waiting to murder you. Why don't you go and sleep on Catherine's grave?" Heathcliff was furious at this, so he reached in through the window and seized Hindley's knife. Hindley received a deep cut on his arm and fainted on the floor. Heathcliff broke the window frame with a stone and jumped into the room, and the rogue kicked Hindley again and again and beat his head against the stone floor. All the while he held me with one hand to prevent me from getting Joseph. When Heathcliff finally stopped beating Hindley, he dragged him to the sofa and tore the sleeve from Hindley's coat and used it to bandage his wounds. I ran off to get Joseph, and Heathcliff made him clean up the blood from the floor. Then he seized me and shook me until my teeth rattled. Joseph said he would go to the Grange to get Edgar, who was a magistrate, and should hear about these events. But Heathcliff convinced him that he was protecting himself from Hindley, who wanted to kill him. Hindley groaned, which showed Joseph that he was still alive, so he decided not to go to the Grange after all. I went to my room relieved that nothing had happened to me. This morning I came downstairs to find Hindley and Heathcliff sitting by the fire. They did not want breakfast, so I ate alone, but when I finished eating, I went back to the fire. I looked at Heathcliff and saw his face, and was glad that he suffered so terribly. Heathcliff told Hindley that he was hurt because he was drunk, but I told him that Heathcliff had done it by kicking and hitting him and beating his head against the stone floor. He said, "I wish I were strong enough to kill him, even if it killed me to do so." "It is enough that he has killed Catherine," I answered. "I remember how happy we all were before he came to this house, and I believe it is his fault that she is dead. Heathcliff hurt me and he wept. I laughed at him, and he told me to go away, but I said I would look after Hindley. If Catherine had been foolish enough to marry you," I said, "she would have stopped your terrible behavior. She would be disgusted with you." Heathcliff snatched a knife from the table and threw it at my head, where it struck me below the ear. I pulled it out and ran out through the door. In my rush, I knocked Hareton over, but could not stop, and I ran down the road as fast as I could run. I would rather be forever in hell than spend another night at Wuthering Heights. Isabella fell into silence and drank some tea. Then she said goodbye and got into the carriage, and before I knew it, she had gone. When I told Edgar about Isabella's visit and her escape from Wuthering Heights, he seemed pleased that his sister was away from Heathcliff. A few months later she wrote a letter to her brother, and he replied, and they continued to write to each other regularly. She had a son soon after she fled, and named him Linton. She wrote that he was a sick, unhealthy boy. Heathcliff saw me in the village one day and asked about Isabella, but I would tell him nothing. He requested information from the other servants and found out where she lived and learned that he now had a son, but he did not trouble her or try to make her come back. Whenever he saw me, he asked about the child and said that he would have him when he wanted him, but this did not happen until the boy's mother died when he was 12 or 13 years old. Edgar avoided Heathcliff and became a hermit, refusing to go to church or to the village, but he was too good to be unhappy forever. He loved his daughter Cathy. 6 months later Hindley died, but it is not clear how he died. I went to Wuthering Heights to see if I could help, and discovered that he died while he was drunk. Heathcliff found him drunk in the room and sent Joseph to get Dr. Kenneth. However, when the doctor arrived, Hindley was already dead. We will never know exactly how he died, while Heathcliff was alone with him. We discovered that Hindley gambled and owed so much money to Heathcliff, and that Hareton would inherit nothing. The house and land now belonged to Heathcliff, and he became the new master. I wanted to take Hareton back to Thrushcross Grange with me, so that his uncle Edgar could look after him. But Heathcliff threatened he would get his own son to live at Wuthering Heights if I did this. We could not let this happen, so Hareton remained at Wuthering Heights with Heathcliff. Chapter 16. Cathy meets her cousin Linton. Mrs. Dean continued to speak. The next 12 years were the happiest of my life. The biggest problems I encountered were Cathy's small illnesses, but she grew quickly and was soon able to walk and talk. She was a very pretty little girl who possessed the Earnshaw's dark eyes, but the Lintons' fair skin and blonde hair. She was a cheerful, affectionate girl who was far gentler than her mother, and made everybody at the Grange amazingly happy. Her father educated her, and she was an outstanding student. Edgar never scolded her or spoke roughly to her. On some occasions, her father would take her a little way beyond the gates of Thrushcross Grange, but she never visited the village. In fact, until she was 13, she never left the Grange by herself, and was unaware that Wuthering Heights existed. Sometimes, looking out the windows at Thrushcross Grange, she would wonder about the distant hills. "What is on the other side? The sea?" she asked. I replied, "Just more hills." She asked about Penistone Crags, the rocky cliffs you can see beyond Wuthering Heights, because she wanted to go there. I told her they were not very interesting, and that Thrushcross Grange was a much nicer place to be. She replied, "But I know Thrushcross Grange, so I want to see the cliffs." She asked her father to take her there, but he did not want to venture on that trip because the road passes directly by Wuthering Heights. He would tell her that she could go there when she was older, but that never satisfied her. Every month she asked the same question, and every month her father gave her the same answer. When Kathy was 13, we received a letter from Isabella telling us that she was ill and wanted to say goodbye to her brother before she died. She also wanted Edgar to come and take her son Linton to Thrushcross Grange, because she thought Heathcliff would not want to look after him. Edgar set off immediately and ordered me to make sure that Kathy did not leave Thrushcross Grange. He was away for 3 weeks. At first, Kathy was too sad to do anything, but then she got bored. I invented a game for her to play, during which she would spend the day roaming around the garden and park, and then tell me her imaginary adventures. Sometimes she was away for the whole day, and spent the whole evening telling me her stories. One morning she said she was going to be a merchant, and would need large quantities of food and drink to take with her. I prepared it for her and waved cheerfully, as she rode off to the park on her pony. She did not return at tea time, so I sent servants to search for her, but they could not find her. I searched for her myself, and asked a farm worker if he saw her. Yes, he said. I saw her jump over the hedge and gallop away. Immediately I guessed that she had gone to Penistone Crags, and I walked quickly in that direction. It was almost dark and I was very worried about her. When I came to Wuthering Heights, I saw one of her dogs near the gate, and I was pleased to see it, even though it had a swollen head and its ear was bleeding. I ran to the house, and the servant who opened the door assured me that Kathy was there, and that Heathcliff and Joseph were both out. They would not return for about an hour. I found Kathy talking cheerfully to Hareton, who was now 18 years old. "You found me," she exclaimed. "Have you ever been here in your life?" I demanded that she put on her hat and come home at once. I said, "I am very angry with you. Your father told me to keep you in the gates, and you have run off, and now nobody will trust you again." "Father didn't tell me anything like that," she replied, "and I am sure he will not be cross with me, because he is never cross with me." The servant tried to calm me and said I should not be angry with her, but I took no notice. "Come, Kathy, it will be dark soon. It's time to go," I said. I tried to put the hat on her head, but she made it a game and hid behind and under the furniture, so that I could not catch her. Hareton and the servant laughed at this craziness. I told her, "If you knew whose house this was, you would be happy to get out." Kathy turned to Hareton and asked, "It's your father's, isn't it?" He replied with embarrassment, "No, it's not." Kathy persisted, "Is it your master's?" Hareton refused to answer. "Who is his master?" she asked me. "He talked about our house, and I thought he was the owner's son. If he is a servant, he should say so, shouldn't he?" Hareton still said nothing, so she told him to get her horse. He lashed out, "I won't get your horse, for I am not your servant." He swore at her. Kathy was surprised. How can he speak like that to me? The servant told her that Hareton was her cousin, and Kathy was shocked by this revelation. She refused to believe it and was then so upset that she gladly came home with me. I explained to her that it would be better if her father did not know about her visit to Wuthering Heights, because he would be very angry with me and might force me to leave. We declared it a secret between us. Edgar wrote to say that Isabella had died and that we should prepare to receive his nephew. Kathy was very happy to hear that her father was returning and imagined wonderful things about her real cousin. On the day they were expected, she waited impatiently near the gates until the carriage finally came into view to mark their arrival. Kathy and her father embraced fondly. I looked inside the carriage to see Linton, but he was asleep and Edgar told me not to disturb him, since the journey had exhausted him. He warned Kathy that Linton was not as strong as she was, and that his mother died only a week ago, so she shouldn't expect him to play with her. He requested that she refrain from talking too much to him, or disturbing him. When Linton was taken out of the carriage, he was introduced to Kathy. He began to cry and said he wanted to go to bed, but we gave him some tea first, because we were quite worried since his appearance made him look weak and sickly. He lay on the sofa, and Kathy sat next to him stroking his hair and kissing his cheeks. Edgar said, "Kathy will help him get stronger if we can keep him here at Thrushcross Grange." I thought there was a little chance of keeping him, for Heathcliff would want him at Wuthering Heights, and I wondered how the child would survive in that awful house. We put the children in bed, and Linton fell asleep immediately. When I came downstairs, Joseph was at the door wanting to speak to the master. I asked him what he wanted, but he would not tell me, so I went to Edgar to tell him that Joseph was there. However, Joseph came with me and pushed past me to speak to him. Joseph announced, "Heathcliff says I must bring his son home to Wuthering Heights immediately." We told him that Linton was asleep and exhausted from traveling, for it had taken its toll on the poor boy. At first, Joseph refused to leave without him, but we persuaded him that we would bring him to Wuthering Heights in the morning. "Heathcliff will arrive and fetch him if you don't deliver," he threatened upon his departure. Chapter 17. Linton Goes to Wuthering Heights. We harbored no desire for Heathcliff to arrive and collect Linton, so Edgar ordered me to arrange his delivery to Wuthering Heights early in the morning. Edgar declared, "We will not be able to possess any influence over his future, so it is better that Kathy remains unaware of his whereabouts. Don't tell her that he is so close to us, because she will want to visit. Instead, we will tell her that his father called for him to live in his home, rather than ours, and we had absolutely no choice but to send him there immediately." Linton was extremely unhappy when we woke him early in the daylight hours and informed him that he must prepare to travel yet again. I attempted to put a positive light on the unexpected and unfortunate turn of events by telling him that he was going to live with his father, Mr. Heathcliff, who desired to see him so much that he must depart immediately. He was surprised, for he didn't know such a figure existed. He asked, "My father?" His voice was incredulous. "Mother never mentioned a father to me." He then inquired where his father lived. "Not far away," I replied. "You must try to love him as you loved your mother, and he will return his love to you." He asked, "Why didn't he live with mother?" I answered, "He had business that required his presence here, and your mother's health forced her to remain in the South." "Why did mother not speak of him? For I don't know how I can love him if I have never heard of him." I did not answer him, for I did not know how you love someone whose existence you have not been notified of. He had a multitude of questions, and I did my best to supply answers to appease his curiosity. I explained, "I think your mother feared that you would leave her and want to live with your father if she mentioned him." Linton asked if the little girl or his uncle were accompanying us, and when he learned that they were not traveling, he argued tremendously and refused to go. We issued false promises to persuade him. We swore to him that it was only a short visit, and we claimed that Kathy and his uncle would visit him at his father's home. Under such false pretense, he finally succumbed and agreed to accompany me. On the way, I attempted to prepare him for his arrival by describing his new home. "Wuthering Heights is not as pleasant as Thrushcross Grange," I said, "and you might find it exceptionally old and quite dark, but it is built amazingly high on the hill, and you can see great distances and go for wonderful walks on the moors. Hareton, who is Kathy's cousin, will show you all the best places." Linton asked what his father was like and wanted to know if Heathcliff was like Edgar. I answered, "He is the same age as Uncle, but he is taller and bigger in stature. He is graced with black hair and dark eyes and looks rather stern, so you will think he is not kind or gentle upon your first meeting, but he will come to love you even more than your uncle does, because he is your father." Linton said, "I can't imagine him, and I doubt that I resemble him." The words I uttered aloud were, "Not much." The answer I refrained from speaking was, "Not at all." This child failed to resemble Heathcliff physically, emotionally, or in personality. Linton murmured, "How strange that he never came to visit us." Linton asked if Heathcliff had ever set his eyes upon him. I said, 300 miles is a great distance, and 10 years is not nearly as long for an adult as it is for a child. He probably intended to visit, but the time was never right. I encourage you to refrain from asking him these questions, because it will disturb him for no good reason." Linton was silent for the remainder of the journey. His silence continued even when we arrived at the house, for he sat for a moment on the pony, looked at the heights, and shook his head. I entered the home where the family was just finishing breakfast. Heathcliff had been anxiously awaiting our arrival. "Nellie," said Heathcliff, "you've brought my property at last. Let's have a look at it." He came outside with Hareton and Joseph, and looked at Linton, who looked back at them, frightened and close to tears. Heathcliff laughed and exclaimed, "This is worse than I expected." Linton placed his head on my shoulder and sobbed. Heathcliff pulled him roughly to stand near him and told him to stop crying. He said, "You are your mother's child, and I cannot see myself in you at all." Heathcliff removed the boy's hat and felt his hair, arms, and fingers. He asked, "Do you know me?" "No," was the answer supplied. "Did your mother never tell you about me? What a wicked mother she was." I spoke my piece to Heathcliff. "I hope you will be kind to him, or you will not keep him long. You should remember that he is the only family you have in the world." He replied, "I will be very kind to him." He sent Joseph to get some breakfast and told Hareton to go to work in the fields. When they were gone, he continued, "He may be the owner of Thrushcross Grange one day," he said. "I hate the boy for the memories he brings and for the weak child that he is, but I will make sure he lives long enough to inherit Thrushcross Grange. I have made a nice room for him, and I have warned Hareton to obey him. I have even employed a tutor to come and teach him, so that he will become a gentleman." Joseph brought some porridge for the boy to eat, but he refused it. Linton said, "I can't eat it." Joseph was exceedingly cross. "Hareton eats it, so why can't you?" "I won't eat it. Take it away," said Linton. Joseph snatched it away and brought it to us. "Is there anything wrong with this food?" he asked. "The boy says he will not eat it, and I declare he is just like his mother." "Don't mention his mother to me," said Heathcliff. "Give him something he can eat." It was then time for me to return to Thrushcross Grange, and I tried to leave without Linton noticing my departure. However, he saw me and cried out, "Don't leave me, for I won't stay here." He repeated himself. As I turned away, I heard them lock the door. Chapter 18. Cathy meets her cousin Linton again. Cathy woke extremely happy that morning and had intended to play with her new cousin. Needless to mention, she was ever so disappointed when she discovered that Linton had departed. His leaving caused great despair, and she cried incessantly. Her father assured her that Linton would return soon if he made the arrangements, but we all knew that there was no hope for such a resolution. As so often happens, after a few weeks passed, Cathy began to ask for Linton less often, and after a few months, his appearance began to fade from her memory. I encountered one of the Wuthering Heights servants in the village and inquired how the boy was faring. The news was unfortunate, for I learned that Heathcliff hardly spoke to him, and Linton's health was still weak. He often spent the whole day in bed, where he complained about windows being left open and demanded a fire in the middle of summer. He studied his lessons and lived an essentially lonely life. He cried whenever he and Hareton were together, rather than enjoying his company. I concluded sadly that Linton Heathcliff had become a selfish boy and worried less about his survival. 2 years later, I lost my connection to Wuthering Heights when that housekeeper departed, and a new one was employed at Heathcliff's home. I settled into normalcy, because life remained quite pleasant at Thrushcross Grange. At least, it remained that way until Cathy reached her 16th birthday. As always, we did not celebrate her birthday because it was also the anniversary of her mother's death, and Edgar was always unhappy then. On this year, we had been granted a beautiful spring day, and Edgar gave his daughter permission to walk outside the gates if she took me with her and promised to return in 1 hour. She was ecstatic and could barely contain her excitement for me to accompany her. "Hurry, Ellen," she said. "I know where I want to go, for I saw some birds, and I want to see if they have made their nest yet." I told her they must be a long way up, because they don't make nests at the edge of the moor. She assured me it wasn't a great distance, and mentioned that she had almost made the trek with her father. She repeatedly ran ahead of me, but always came back to my side before running off again. I enjoyed watching her playfulness, because she was a very beautiful and joyful girl, whose happiness was contagious. "Where are the birds?" I asked her. "We have come a long way now." I began to worry we had wandered too far, and had spent more than the time Edgar had allotted us. "Just a little further," she said, and took off in a jaunty sprint again. At last I decided I must enforce some control, and I told her we had to stop and return to Thrushcross Grange. I shouted to her because she was a long way ahead. She did not hear me and was getting close to Wuthering Heights. From behind her, I saw two people stop her and talk to her, and I was certain that one of them was Heathcliff because she was on his land. When I caught up to them, she was explaining that she did not intend to take any eggs. Rather, she only wanted to see them because her father said that they existed. Heathcliff asked, "Who is your father, then?" "Mr. Linton of Thrushcross Grange," she replied. "Who are you? And who is that man?" "I've seen him before. Perhaps he is your son?" The man accompanying Heathcliff was Hareton. I interrupted, "Miss Cathy, we have been out for 3 hours, instead of the one we promised, so we must return immediately." Heathcliff pushed me away. He answered Cathy's query. "No, this is not my son, but I do have one, and you have seen him before too. If you come to my house and have a little rest, you will get home sooner, and you will receive a pleasant welcome." I whispered to Cathy that she must not accept this invitation, but she ignored me. Heathcliff sent Hareton ahead with Cathy, and took my arm as he forced me to walk with him. I was angry with Heathcliff, and told him so. I said, "I'm sure you have bad intentions." Heathcliff was firm when he spoke. "I'll tell you my intentions," he replied. "I want my son to marry Cathy. If her father dies, she will be left with nothing because my son, his nephew, will inherit Thrushcross Grange instead. If they are married, she will still live there. Therefore I want them to marry, and I will make that happen." I argued that if his son died, Cathy would inherit, but he did not agree. He declared that he would inherit. We came to the house and went inside, and I saw Linton standing by the fire after being out for a walk. He still looked sickly, but he was much taller than before, so Cathy did not recognize him. Cathy asked, "Is he your son?" Yes, this is my son," said Heathcliff. "Linton, don't you remember your cousin?" "Linton?" exclaimed Cathy. "Is that little Linton? He's taller than I am." She was ecstatic to see him and kissed him on the cheek. They looked at each other and spoke to each other for a few moments, and then Cathy went to her uncle. "So, you are my uncle," she said. "Why don't you come to visit the Grange with Linton? You have lived so close all these years, and we have never seen you, and I don't understand why you've stayed away." Heathcliff offered her an answer. "I visited the Grange too often before you were born." "Wicked Ellen," Cathy exclaimed. "You tried to prevent me from coming here, but now that I know, I will take this walk every morning from now on. May I, uncle? And if I bring father, won't you be pleased to see us?" "Yes, of course," replied Heathcliff. "I must warn you, however, that your father and I quarreled long ago, and if you tell him about these visits, he will stop you." This piqued Cathy's curiosity, so she asked, "Why did you quarrel?" He explained, "Your father was very unhappy when I married his sister, because I was too poor, so I had hurt his pride and he will never forgive me." "Withholding forgiveness is wrong," Cathy replied, "and I will tell him one day. I know what to do. If I cannot come here, Linton will come to me." Linton spoke up. "I cannot walk that far because it would kill me." "What a weak, useless boy," Heathcliff murmured to me. "Look, he is drying his feet instead of looking at her. Linton!" "Yes, father?" "Take your cousin into the garden or the stables, and show her your horse." Linton turned to Cathy. "Wouldn't you rather sit here?" "I don't know," she said. By looking at the door, she showed she clearly preferred to be outside. Linton stayed in his chair and moved it closer to the fire. Heathcliff went to the yard and called Hareton. When he came in, Cathy asked Heathcliff, "Is this man my cousin too?" "Yes, he is," replied Heathcliff. "Don't you like him?" He told Hareton to take Cathy for a walk round the farm, and warned him to maintain gentlemanly behavior. He said, "Don't use bad words, don't stare, don't look at the young lady unless she speaks to you, and don't put your hands in your pockets. Be as nice as you can." We watched them walk past the window. Heathcliff said, "He won't say a word." Then he posed a question. Did I look so stupid at his age? I answered that he had been far worse. "You looked angry as well as stupid." "You know," he said, "I am very proud of Hareton. I have made him more stupid and useless than he already was. Meanwhile, he thanks me for being his only friend, and I find that a wonderful revenge against his drunken father. I continue to make my own son better than Hareton, so that he can be the master of Thrushcross Grange." He laughed a wicked laugh, but I said nothing. Linton sat too far away to hear this conversation and lazed restlessly by the fire until his father called him a lazy boy and told him to go and join the other two outside, and Linton obeyed. We could hear Kathy asking Hareton about the writing above the door, and Hareton admitted that he could neither read nor write. Kathy asked Linton if Hareton was simple. Linton laughed coldly. "Do you hear, Hareton? That's what happens if you hate books and learning and laugh at those who love them. People will deem you simple, and now your cousin thinks you are simple." He then turned toward Kathy and said, "He is only lazy, Kathy. Have you noticed how badly he pronounces his words?" Hareton said, "What the devil is the use of it?" The two cousins found this outrageously funny and ridiculed him. "What is the use of devil in that sentence?" asked Linton. "Father asked you not to say any bad words, but as soon as you open your mouth, you say one." He admonished Hareton and said, "Try to be a gentleman." "If you were more of a boy than a girl, I would knock you down," exclaimed Hareton before leaving in a huff. Linton and Kathy continued talking about and laughing at Hareton's faults. As they enjoyed their ridicule, I began to like Linton less. Chapter 19. Kathy disobeys her father. We stayed until the afternoon because I could not get Kathy to leave any earlier. On the way home, I tried to tell her how bad the people at Wuthering Heights were, but she would not listen. She said, "You are just agreeing with Father, and I'm so angry that you told me Linton was far away, when all the time he was just here." She continued, "However, I am so pleased to see him that I cannot show my anger, not even at Father, although I am angry at him, and I shall scold him for quarreling with Uncle." Happily, Edgar did not come out of his room all day, and didn't notice our long absence. The next morning, however, she told her father what happened and complained that he did not tell her that Linton was so close. Edgar asked, "Why do you think I hid the truth from you?" She replied, "Because you don't like Mr. Heathcliff." He said, "Then you think I care more for my own feelings than for yours." "No, it is not because I don't like Heathcliff, but because he doesn't like me. He is a terrible man and will do everything he can to hurt people he does not like. And let me assure you that he will hurt you because he does not like me, and he knows that will hurt me more than anything. It is for your own good that I made sure that you did not know where Linton was." Kathy retorted, "But Mr. Heathcliff was very friendly, and he said I could come to his house whenever I liked. He said that I must not tell you, because you and he quarreled about his marriage to Aunt Isabella. But Linton and I are not part of your quarrel, so we should be allowed to be friends." Edgar told her briefly about Heathcliff's behavior toward Isabella, and how Wuthering Heights became his property. He could not talk about it long, because it upset him too much, and in his mind, Heathcliff was Catherine's murderer. Kathy was not used to thinking about bad behavior, and revenge that continued for years, and even went beyond the grave, so she was shocked. Edgar added one final thought. "That is why I want you to cease visits and avoid all contact with the house and the family." Kathy sat quietly for the remainder of the day, but that evening I found her crying in her room. I scolded her for being selfish and reminded her that not seeing Linton was only small suffering compared to the problems that other people faced. She told me she was not crying for herself, but for Linton, because she promised to see him the next day, and now she would be unable to keep her promise. He would be sad because she had promised him some books too. "Can't I write him a note?" she asked. "I want to tell him why I cannot come." "No, you will absolutely not write him a note," I exclaimed. "If you do, he will write a reply and there would never be an end of it. Your father said you should drop the idea, and I intend to make sure that it happens." She started to argue. "But how can one little note—" "Silence," I shouted. "Get into bed." I would not kiss her goodnight and left the room, but I felt a bit of remorse, and I changed my mind a few moments later and went back to kiss her. I found her at the table with a blank sheet of paper and a pencil, so I took it from her and warned her that nobody would take it to Wuthering Heights for her if she tried to do it again. I extinguished the candle and left the room in darkness. The weeks passed and Kathy's cheerfulness resumed. She became fond of reading, but sometimes I noticed that she had loose pieces of paper sticking out beyond the pages of the book. She also had a new habit. She would come down early in the morning and wait near the kitchen as if expecting something. It took a while before I determined the reason for her early mornings. She had a drawer in a cupboard in the library, which she always locked carefully. One day when she opened the drawer, I noticed that it was full of pieces of paper, and I grew suspicious. That night I found another key for that drawer and removed all the paper from it. As I suspected, they were notes from Linton, but not just any notes. They were love letters. Most of them were very childish, but many of them contained bits that were likely written by an adult. I placed the letters in my cupboard and locked the empty drawer. The next morning I observed Kathy, as she came down early and went to the door, when the little boy came to the door and a dairymaid filled his can with milk. While she did this, Kathy took something from his pocket and replaced it with something else, so I charged myself with determining what had been exchanged, and followed the boy and took the letter from him. Later in the library, I watched as Kathy went to her locked drawer, opened it, and expressed surprise at its emptiness. I scolded her about the letters and threatened to tell her father. She begged me to give the letters back, but finally we agreed to burn them all if she would never write another. Together we watched the letters burn. The next morning I took the letter the little boy brought and gave him one to take back. It said, "Please do not send any more letters, as Miss Kathy will not receive them." Chapter 20. An Accidental Meeting with Heathcliff. During autumn that year, Edgar and his daughter often spent time together walking in the evenings. Edgar caught a dreadfully bad cold, and he remained in bed most of the winter. Kathy was sad after the end of her emotional romance with Linton, and her father ordered that she read less and take more exercise to help her ailing heart. I took her father's place upon his sickness and accompanied her on her evening outings. One afternoon, I looked at the clouds and told Kathy I thought it would rain, and expressed hesitation at venturing out for the evening walk. However, she insisted that we not cancel our outing, and we set off down the path to the park. She walked sadly now, and the days of running ahead and coming back to my side were part of the past. As we walked, I saw a little flower, perhaps the last of the autumnal season, and pointed it out to Kathy. I suggested, "Why don't you pick it and show it to your father? I thought it would bring home a bit of pleasure to him." She looked at it for a while, but she decided not to pick it, because she said it looked desperately sad and lonely. "As sad and lonely as you are," I tried to pick up our pace in order to cheer her. "Come, let's run." She didn't want to run, and we walked slowly on. She began to cry, and I put my arm around her shoulders to console her. "Don't cry," I said. "Your father only has a cold, and you must be thankful it is nothing worse." She glumly said, "But it will be something worse one day, and how sad the world will be when he and you are dead." I pointed out that her father was still young, and that my mother lived until the ripe age of 80 years. At that time, I did not envision Kathy would need to worry about death falling upon Thrushcross Grange. Kathy said, "But Aunt Isabella was younger than father." "Yes," I replied, "but she did not have you and me to look after her, and she had little to live for. If we look after your father and don't upset him, he will live for many years. I think you could kill him if you continued your romance with that silly boy at Wuthering Heights or made yourself sad about him." Kathy replied, "I am only sad about father's illness, and I will never do anything to upset him. I want to live longer than him, so that he will not be sad when I am dead." We walked along the park wall until we came to a door that went through to the road outside, and Kathy saw some fruit high on a tree on the other side of the wall, so she climbed up the wall to pick it. Her hat fell off, and as the door was locked, she decided to climb down the other side to get it. Then she laughed and called out to me, "Ellen, you will have to get a key for the door, because the wall is too difficult to climb on this side." I had some keys in my pocket and tried them one by one, but none of them fit the lock. I panicked when I heard the sound of a horse approaching. I whispered, "Who is that?" Kathy whispered back, "Ellen, I wish you could open the door." It was Heathcliff, and he said he wanted to talk to her, but she told him that she would not speak to him because her father said he was a wicked man. You hate him and you hate me too. We won't argue about that, he said. My feelings of hatred do not matter, because I don't hate my son, and it is about him that I want to speak to you. Since you have stopped writing to him, he has become very ill, and unless you write to him again, he will die. How can you lie to that poor child? I called out from my side of the wall. Kathy, don't believe him, for it is impossible that someone would die for the love of a stranger. Heathcliff was angry to discover that I was there, but continued to talk to Kathy, repeating that only she could save his son from death. I attacked the lock with a rock and broke it open just in time to hear Heathcliff explain he would be absent for a week, and we could visit his son during that time. I grasped Kathy's arm and began to drag her back through the gate, but Heathcliff brought his horse close to her and begged her to go and see Linton, and tell him that she didn't hate him. I closed the door just as it began to rain, and we hurried back to the house. That evening, as we sat together in the library, Kathy began to weep again, and I reminded her to take no notice of Heathcliff's words. You may be right, Ellen, she answered, but I will not be happy till I know. I must tell Linton it is not my fault that I do not write. We went to bed angry with each other, and the next morning found me on the road to Wuthering Heights, with my young mistress beside me. Chapter 21. Kathy and Linton Quarrel. It was a rainy morning and my feet got soaking wet during this dreaded trip to Wuthering Heights. My mood suffered too, for I was extremely cross before our fateful trip even placed us at the entryway to the Heights. We entered via the kitchen and saw Joseph sitting by a large warm fire with a drink, some cakes, and his pipe. Kathy quickly approached the fire to warm her chilled body. She inquired, "Is the master home?" Joseph took an inordinately long time to answer, and when he did, he answered rudely, "No, you'll have to go back where you came from." At the same time, a weak, annoyed voice called from the main room, "Joseph, how often must I call you? The fire is almost out now, so please come immediately." Joseph smoked his pipe and stared into the fire, so Kathy and I went into the room from which we had just heard Linton's voice. "I hope you starve to death," said Linton, before he realized it was not Joseph who had come to his aid, but rather Kathy and me. Kathy approached him and hoped to bestow him with a caring kiss. He said a bit harshly, "Don't kiss me, because it makes me too tired. Father assured me that you would come. Please shut the door because it's very cold, and the servants refused to bring me any coal." I acquiesced and brought some coal myself, because he did look very ill. Kathy asked, "Are you glad to see me, Linton?" He questioned her actions rather than answering her question. "Why didn't you come before? Because you should have come to visit instead of writing all those letters. It made me very tired to write to you, and I would much rather talk, and now I am too tired to write or talk. Actually, I need a drink, but I suppose Zillah is in the village again." I inquired, "Does your father look after you?" Linton replied, "He makes the servants responsible for my care, but I hate them all, especially Hareton, because he laughs at me." Kathy found some water and poured him some, as she repeated her earlier question, "Are you pleased to see me, Linton?" He granted her response this time. "Yes, I am, but I was annoyed, because you wouldn't come. Father blamed me and said you hated me. But you don't hate me, do you?" She answered, No, I love you more than anyone except Father and Ellen, but I don't like Mr. Heathcliff, and I dare not come when he is here." Linton said, "He often goes out shooting now, so you could visit me while he is absent, and that would help me. You would help me, wouldn't you?" "Yes," replied Kathy. "If Father would agree, I would spend half my time with you because I so wish you were my brother." He answered, "I'd prefer you to be my wife, so then you would love me even more than your father." Kathy replied, "I can't love anybody more than my father, and besides, sometimes people hate their wives, but they seldom dislike their brothers or sisters." Linton disagreed, so Kathy pointed out that his father hated his mother, and told him what her father said about Heathcliff and Isabella. "That's not true," shouted Linton. And I'll tell you something. Your mother hated your father, and she loved my father." Kathy exclaimed furiously. "That's a lie. You are a liar. I hate you now." "She did! She did! She did!" shouted Linton hatefully. Kathy was furious and pushed the chair, and this caused Linton to fall against one arm, and he began to cough in such a fit that I thought he would never stop. Kathy became dreadfully frightened, but to our relief, Linton finally stopped. He wouldn't look at Kathy and continued to sigh and groan until Kathy apologized. Even after Kathy apologized, he refused to speak to her and complained that he would cough all night because of what she had done. When Kathy asked if she should leave, he requested that she stop talking because it made him too tired. We decided to leave, but as we departed, Linton screamed. We looked back to see that he had fallen from his chair and lay on the floor. I could plainly see he was pretending, but Kathy was fooled and she rushed back to him and comforted him until he was quiet again. I made him comfortable on the sofa and urged Kathy to start for home with me. She put a pillow under Linton's head, but he threw it away and said it was not high enough, and she brought another and put both under his head. Now he complained that it was too high. He was insufferable while she was making every effort possible to make him happy. Kathy asked, "What should I do?" He leaned sorrowfully against her and put his head on her shoulder. I told her, "Give him the pillow, Kathy, but then we must go." Kathy refused. He's quiet now. Linton called out, "You must come again tomorrow to cure me, for it is your fault that I am hurt." He wanted her to sing to him or tell him a story, and I think she chose the longest story she could remember, and then told him another. She continued telling him stories until Hareton arrived for dinner. We left after Kathy promised Linton she would come again tomorrow. As we went home, I informed her that I would forbid her to visit tomorrow. She indignantly reminded me that she was 17 years old and that I could not stop her. She declared Thrushcross Grange was not a prison that I could lock her in. She asked, "Don't you like him, Ellen?" "Like him?" I exclaimed. "I think he is awful." "I'm sure he will die soon, and that will be a good thing." She did not like what I said, so the rest of the trip home was made in utter silence. Walking to Wuthering Heights in the harsh temperatures and rain gave me a frightful cold, and I had to remain bedridden for 3 weeks. Edgar and Kathy looked after me, and my care managed to keep her very busy and happy. She spent time on her own every evening, but never did I suspect that she was going to Wuthering Heights to spend time with Linton. Chapter 22. More Trouble at Wuthering Heights. When the first night after my illness ceased, I asked Kathy to read to me in the evening, and though she didn't seem pleased, she agreed. She catered to my desire for about an hour, and then began to ask if I wasn't tired and wanted to go to bed. I didn't understand her insistence and felt as though she were trying to get rid of me. I told her I was not tired, so she read again until she declared her own tiredness and retired to bed. The next evening she was even more impatient, and on the third evening she complained of a headache and retired to bed early. An hour later, I went up to see her but could not find her. I waited in her room looking out through the window into the inky darkness. A few minutes later, I saw her stealthily enter through the gates and slip into the house through a window. She snuck upstairs very quietly and entered her room, closed the door, and took great effort not to make a noise. When she took off her shoes and hat, I stood up and surprised her. I demanded to know where she had gone. "To the park," she lied. I was so very disappointed that she lied, and expressed my disappointment in her. She immediately came and put her arms around my neck. She said, "I was afraid you would be angry. If you promise not to be angry, I will tell you everything, because I hate hiding the truth." Kathy began to tell me her story. "I went to Wuthering Heights almost every night that you were ill, because I promised Linton that I would come. The first night he was very happy to see me, and we chatted cheerfully with each other. Then I wanted to play some games, but he would not play. Finally, he agreed, but he got cross when I won the game. He was happy again, though, when I sang some songs for him, and I came home each night with great happiness. The next night, Hareton met me at the gate to take my pony, and told me he could now read the writing above the door. He read it to me, but when I asked him about the numbers, he still couldn't read those. I laughed at him and told him to take the pony, because I was here to talk to Linton, and did not want to be bothered with him. I found Linton and began to read to him from one of my books. Hareton angrily entered the room and seized Linton by the arm and threw him into the kitchen. I followed into the kitchen, and Hareton locked the door. Joseph was still in the kitchen, and he did nothing but laugh at this situation. Linton shook the door and shouted at Hareton, "If you don't let me in, I will kill you because you are a devil." Joseph laughed again. So, he has some of his father in him after all. I tried to pull Linton away from the door, but I stopped when he screamed. He began to cough fitfully, and blood came from his mouth, and he fell on the floor, so I ran out and found Zillah. Hareton and Joseph took Linton upstairs, and would not let me see him. In fact, Hareton told me to go home, and I told him that he had killed Linton, and that I would tell my father in order to ensure Hareton would go to prison. He began to cry, but they forced me to leave. Hareton followed me, but I hit him with my whip. The next night I did not go, but the night after that, I went again only to find Linton in his room reading a book. However, he would not look at me or speak to me for over an hour. When he did speak, it was to blame me for the trouble 2 nights ago, and to say that it was not Hareton's fault. The next night I stayed away again, but I was very unhappy, and I decided that I should go again the following night to say goodbye. When I arrived, I told him this was my last visit, but Linton told me he was very sorry for his behavior. He wished that he could be like me and said he loved me. We both cried, and I have been there every night since then, though mostly I have been unhappy. Now you know the whole story, Ellen. Please, don't tell my father. I said I would think about it, but I went straight to her father's room and told him. He told Kathy that he forbade her to go there again. When Kathy begged to see Linton, he said Linton could come to Thrushcross Grange, but she was not to go to Wuthering Heights. Edgar would regret this kindness. Chapter 23. Kathy walks into a trap. Mrs. Dean continued her enthralling story. These things happened during the course of our last winter, just over 1 year ago. I certainly did not expect to be telling the story to a stranger so soon afterwards, but perhaps you will not be a stranger long, for I notice that when I mention Kathy, you have more interest in the story, and it may be that you love her. I replied, "Perhaps I will love her, but will she love me? It is not likely. Please continue with your story, as I would like to know if Kathy obeyed her father." Mrs. Dean informed me that Kathy did not defy her father, and followed his orders exactly. Edgar wanted Linton to visit Thrushcross Grange, you're right, but he would not allow Kathy to visit him in person. He expressed great concern about whether I thought Linton could grow to be a good man. I declared, "He is not like his father, and if Kathy marries him, she will likely be able to control him." Edgar was now becoming very ill, and was certain his death would now happen within the next few months, or even weeks. With his impending death, he was worried about Kathy's future. If she married Linton, then she would maintain the best chance of staying at Thrushcross Grange. In the spring, Edgar began to walk again, and Kathy was extremely happy. On her 17th birthday, it was much too cold and wet for Edgar to visit Catherine's grave. Edgar wrote to Linton and asked him to visit Thrushcross Grange. Linton replied that his father would not allow him to come to Thrushcross Grange, so he suggested that Edgar come with Kathy and meet him somewhere between the two houses. Edgar could not agree to this suggestion because he was not well enough to accompany her. He wrote to Linton that it may be possible in the summer, when the temperatures are more amenable, but Linton wrote to say they should meet soon, or he would believe that he was being deceived. Of course, it was evident to me that Linton's father was telling him what to write. However, what we did not know was that Linton was just as ill as Edgar, and that his cruel father was forcing him to sound eager. Late in the summer, Edgar finally acquiesced and allowed Kathy and me to venture out and meet Linton on the land between the two houses. It was a miserably hot and uncomfortable day when we started out. We went to the assigned place where we were to meet, but Linton was not present. We encountered a small boy in the appointed place, and he asked us to travel a little bit further. We were not happy with this suggestion because Edgar had ordered us to stay on Thrush Cross Grange land. We went on, however, and found Linton lying on the grass. He stood up as we grew closer, but he looked very ill. Kathy addressed him. "Are you worse than usual?" "No, better, better," he groaned, but the look on his pale face gave away his tiredness. He said, "Let us rest here." Kathy attempted to talk to him, but he did not seem able to concentrate on her words. It was quite clear that he did not desire our presence, and Kathy suggested we return to Thrush Cross Grange immediately. Her decision to depart worried Linton, and he practically begged us to stay for another half-hour. Kathy argued that he would be more comfortable at home, but he asked us to stay and rest. He said, "Please tell Uncle that I am well." Kathy replied, "I will tell him that you declare you are well, but I can see that I would not speak the truth." He said, "Thank your father for allowing you to come here, and please, return next week." He continued, "If you see my father, don't look sad, because that will make him angry." Kathy replied, "I don't care if he is angry." Linton insisted that he did care. He begged, "Please, don't make him angry." I asked, "Does he treat you badly?" He did not give us an answer, and Kathy sat beside him another 10 minutes, until he fell asleep. Kathy spent time looking for berries on the moor. She asked, "Can't we go now?" I answered, "We can't leave him asleep." As we talked about his health, he woke up. He said, "I thought I heard my father. Is he here?" "No," Kathy said. "We must go. I am disappointed with our meeting, and I will mention it to no one." Linton cried out that he wanted us to stay. Then he said, "My father is coming." This made her hurry to her pony, while encouraging me to rush as well, and we were soon gone. We did not know what to think about this strange meeting, and we told Kathy's father very little about it. Edgar became even more severely ill, and every day he looked so much worse that even Kathy noticed. She sat with him day and night, even though she hated to be away from him. We did go to see Linton on the following Thursday, as we had promised. It was a beautiful sunny afternoon, and we found Linton at the same location as the previous week. Kathy told me to remain on my horse, as she intended to stay with him only a few moments before returning to her sick father. However, I defied that order and dismounted from my horse so that I could stay close to her. He waited until we were close to him before expressing his unhappiness that she was late. He then inquired about Edgar. "Isn't your father very ill? I thought you wouldn't come." Kathy asked, "Why did you want me to come if you knew my father is very ill? You should have sent me a message and told me not to come." She exhibited her anger and wanted to leave immediately. But Linton threw himself on the ground and clung to her dress. "If you leave me now, I will be killed," he groaned. "You said you loved me, and if you agree, he might let me die with you. My life is in your hands." He began to cry. "Agree with what?" asked Kathy. He wailed, "My father threatened me, but I cannot tell you." I heard a noise in the bushes and observed Heathcliff approach us. He gave no notice to the young couple and greeted me cheerfully. "How are you, Nellie? And how are things at Thrush Cross Grange? People are saying that Edgar Linton is on his deathbed." I confirmed the news. "Yes, my master is dying." Heathcliff said, "I wish he would hurry, or my boy will certainly die before him." I replied, he should see a doctor and stay in bed, instead of coming out to the moor and talking to Kathy. Linton was lying on the ground again, and Heathcliff told him to get up, but he was too weak and couldn't do it. Heathcliff picked him up and leaned him against a rock. He was exceedingly angry, and Linton was quite afraid. Heathcliff asked Kathy to help Linton home, but Kathy followed orders and said she could not go into Wuthering Heights because her father had forbidden it. Linton sobbed that he was not allowed to come back into the house without her. "Stop," shouted his father. "Nellie, you take him in and I will call a doctor as you suggested." I declared, "I will not leave my mistress." "Then I shall have to take him myself," said Heathcliff. "No, no, no," screamed Linton. "Cathy, come with me, please, please." He begged and sobbed and held on to her until she agreed. She went in and I waited at the door for her to come out, but Heathcliff pushed me in, closed the door and secured the lock. Cathy went up to Heathcliff and demanded the key. She tried to snatch it from his hand, but he held on to the key and threatened to knock her down. She seized his hand and bit it, but when she did, he pulled her onto his knee and slapped her head repeatedly. I tried to stop him, but he pushed me away and I fell. He stopped the insane beating, and Cathy stood by the table shocked and bewildered, before coming to me and weeping. Heathcliff threatened to hit her again if she did not do as she was told, and then he made some tea and locked us in the room while he went out to look for the horses. We questioned Linton about his father's intentions, and he told us that we were to stay there that night, so that the next day he and Cathy would marry, and Cathy would take him home to Thrushcross Grange. I was furious, and told him Cathy would not marry him. I shook him, but he began to cough and cry. Cathy looked around. "I cannot stay here all night," she said insistently. "I will burn the door down if I have to, because I must leave." Linton wailed, "Please, won't you save me and take me to your house? You can't leave me now, and you must obey my father." He sobbed and coughed. Cathy was defiant. "I must obey my own father, for he will be very worried about us." Heathcliff returned and scolded Linton for crying, before ordering him to bed. Linton slipped from the room like a frightened dog. Cathy begged Heathcliff to let her go home, because her absence would create much worry and unhappiness for her father. Cathy's comment only fueled Heathcliff. "That makes me more determined to keep you here," he replied. She begged, "Marry me now, but send Ellen, because I must let father know that I am safe." Heathcliff refused even as she knelt at his feet. He kicked her and told her that he hated her. Suddenly we heard voices outside, and Heathcliff went out immediately to see who it was. I suggested, "Perhaps it's Hareton, and maybe he will help us." Heathcliff returned and told us it was 3 servants from Thrushcross Grange, who had been sent in search of us. He then locked us in a bedroom upstairs all night. In the morning he brought Cathy, but he left me captive. Hareton served me enough food to sustain me for the entire day. I was held captive there for 4 days, and during that time the only person I saw was Hareton, who brought me food once a day. Chapter 24. Freedom and Death. On the 5th afternoon of my captivity, Zillah entered the room and informed me that everybody in the village thought that Cathy and I had drowned in the Black Horse Marsh. She said, "Mr. Heathcliff told me he rescued you and looked after you." I exclaimed, "Your master is a rogue and a liar." Zillah said, "He said you could go home to Thrushcross Grange, and Cathy would come home later, but still in time for her father's funeral." I asked her if Edgar had died. She replied, "No, the doctor thinks he will survive 1 more day." I rushed downstairs and discovered Linton lying on the sofa. I demanded to know the whereabouts of Cathy. He told me, "She is in her room because we won't release her." I reminded Linton that he must have forgotten all her kindness to him. "She brought you books, she sang for you, and she told you stories. She wrote you letters, and she came to visit you when you were sick. She had pity for you, but you clearly have none for her since you are leaving her alone in a strange house." He said, "I cannot be with her because her constant crying makes me so ill I can't bear it. Father says she is my wife and should not leave me." I then asked Heathcliff's whereabouts. Linton replied, "He is outside talking to Dr. Kenneth, who says Uncle will die very soon now. When he does, everything will be mine, including her books and her pony." She showed me her locket with pictures of her father and mother, and I said that was mine too. But when I tried to take it from her, she wouldn't give it to me. My father heard the quarrel and knocked her down before he took the pictures and crushed the picture of her father. He kept the picture of her mother. She showed me her cut lip and the blood in her mouth and refuses to speak a word to me now. Mrs. Dean continued to speak. He wouldn't tell me which room she was in or give me the key, so I decided the best course of action was to go to Thrushcross Grange and try to rescue her from there. Everyone at the Grange was surprised and delighted to see me, for they had believed me perished. I assured them that Kathy was alive too, before I went up to see Edgar, who looked much worse than just a week ago, when Kathy and I had started out for our fateful meeting. When I told him Kathy would soon come to see him, he sat up and then fainted. When he recovered, I told him about our stay at Wuthering Heights, and he decided that he had better change his will to protect Kathy after his death. He asked me to summon a lawyer and instruct men to head to Wuthering Heights to get Kathy back. I sent one servant to the village to get the lawyer and 4 men with weapons to free Kathy from her prison. The single servant returned first and alerted us that the lawyer was busy in the village, but would come up before morning. The others also returned, but they were without Kathy because Heathcliff told them Kathy was too ill to leave her room. He would not let them see her, so I decided that I would go with them the next morning and rescue Kathy, even if we had to kill Heathcliff in his house. At 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Kathy threw her arms around my neck and sobbed, "Is father still alive?" "Yes, he is," I replied. I was very pleased she was safe with us again, and away from the clutches of Heathcliff. She wanted to rush upstairs immediately, but I made her clean her face and be calm first. Kathy told us that she heard the men from Thrushcross Grange asking for her, and the sounds of their voices made her desperate. She finally convinced Linton to unlock the door, and she escaped. I said I would tell Edgar she was here, but insisted she must say she was happy with Linton. She understood my reasons for this. When she came upstairs, she sat quietly with him, and he died peacefully in her arms. The lawyer came late that morning because he went to Wuthering Heights first. Heathcliff paid him to be his lawyer. When the lawyer arrived, he said Heathcliff told him to dismiss all the servants, except 1 manservant and me. Later, he tried but failed to stop us from burying Edgar next to his wife. The day after the funeral, Kathy and I sat in the library and shared our hopes that we would be allowed to stay at Thrushcross Grange, and that Linton would join us there. Heathcliff, however, had different ideas. He arrived and came straight to the library, where he stopped Kathy as she tried to leave. Heathcliff told her she had to come to Wuthering Heights and live there to look after Linton. "I punished him for helping you escape," he said, "and he needs to be nursed. He is your husband, so he is your problem, and I have no more interest in him." "Can't she stay here?" I suggested. "You hate them both. Why do you want them at your house?" "I'm looking for a tenant for Thrushcross Grange," he said, "and I want my children near me. She must earn her bread." "I will come," said Kathy. "I am not frightened of you, and you cannot stop me from loving Linton." "I do not need to stop you," said Heathcliff. "He will stop you himself, because he is an awful boy." "Yes," agreed Kathy. "He is your son, but he loves me, so I will love him. No one loves you, though, and no one will be sorry when you die." He called her a witch and told her to get her things and prepare to leave. She left the room, and when she did, Heathcliff smiled as he told me what happened at the graveside. He told me when they were digging Edgar's grave next to Catherine's, he asked them to open her coffin so he could see her face, and it was still recognizable. Then he took one side of her coffin away, the opposite side from Edgar. He bribed the gravedigger with a sum of money and told him to make sure that when he is dead and buried, the side of his coffin will also be taken away, so that the coffins would be like one double coffin. He declared a victory. "Catherine and I will be together in death." I exclaimed, "You were very wicked, for you should never disturb the dead." He said, "I did not disturb her, but she disturbs me." He told me that on the night after her burial, he returned to the graveyard and dug down to the coffin because he wanted to hold her in his arms once more. He was trying to open the coffin when he heard her sigh, and he felt she was not in the coffin, but out of it with him. This feeling made him happy, and he filled the grave again while she stayed with him and led him home. He spoke to her as they walked, and when he arrived home he rushed to her room, for he was certain that he would see her there. He could almost see her, but not quite, although he felt reassured by her presence. Kathy returned and said she was ready to leave Thrushcross Grange. She kissed me goodbye, and I noticed her lips were as cold as ice. "Come and see me soon," she said. Heathcliff told me, "You may not come to see her, and if I need you, I will come and speak to you here." They departed for Wuthering Heights. Chapter 25. Another Death and Another Quarrel. I defied Heathcliff and I went to Wuthering Heights, but I did not see Kathy because Joseph refused me entry. He insisted she was busy and the master was out. I encountered Zillah in the village one day just about 6 weeks ago, and she explained what happened after Kathy's residence of Wuthering Heights began. When Kathy arrived at Wuthering Heights, she immediately ascended the stairs to Linton's room and stayed there all night. In the morning she came down and asked that the doctor be called because Linton was very ill. Heathcliff said, "We know that, but his life is not worth anything, so I will not spend anything on him." Kathy said, "If we don't help him, he will die." Heathcliff's response was chilling. "Let him die." Zillah said she felt great pity for Kathy, and she thought they should call the doctor, but she did not dare disobey her master, because she feared losing her position. A few days later, Kathy called her and asked her to inform the master that Linton was dying, but she didn't dare to disturb Heathcliff. A few hours later, she called again, and this time they all went to Linton's room, only to find him dead, and Kathy sitting next to him. Heathcliff asked how Kathy felt, but Kathy offered no response. He repeated the question and Kathy murmured a response. "He is safe, and I am free, but I feel like death." Kathy stayed upstairs for 2 weeks and saw no one. Heathcliff went up to show her Linton's will, because he left everything to him and nothing to her. The first time she came downstairs, Zillah told Hareton to get cleaned up and behave himself, and Hareton tried to be pleasant to her. Kathy sat at some distance from the others in the room. Even though Hareton helped her retrieve some books from a high shelf, she didn't thank him. He stood behind her looking at the pictures and the books until she told him to go away. He backed away slightly and started looking at her hair. He reached out and touched it, but she turned around and scolded him, and he sat quietly on the sofa. He whispered to Zillah to ask Kathy to read to them, but when Zillah asked, Kathy refused. She said, "I despise all of you, for you could not be friendly when I needed you, so I will not accept your kindness now." Hareton declared there was nothing he could do, because Heathcliff would not let him help. "Be quiet," she said angrily. "You can go to hell," exclaimed Hareton. Zillah said this is how things remained at Wuthering Heights. No one liked Kathy, and she liked no one. She was rude to Heathcliff and ignored Hareton. When Zillah told me this, I thought I would get a small house in the village and invite Kathy to live with me there, but I knew Heathcliff would not allow it. Mrs. Dean finished her story. I told her, "I am getting stronger, and I will ride to Wuthering Heights in the next day or two, when I intend to tell Heathcliff that he can find another tenant. I will go to London, and I will not spend another winter here." Chapter 26. An Argument About Books. Yesterday was extremely bright and calm, and I traveled to Wuthering Heights, bearing a note for Kathy from Mrs. Dean. When I arrived, Hareton Earnshaw was lingering in the garden, and he looked like a gentleman, but acted as an uneducated man. He informed me that Heathcliff was out, but would return in an hour, so I went inside to await his return. Hareton came in with me, and we found Kathy preparing some vegetables for that evening's dinner. She ignored me, and I thought she was exceptionally beautiful, but unfriendly. Hareton asked her to move her things to the kitchen. She growled, "Move them yourself," She then distanced herself by going to sit by the window. I pretended to look at the garden through the window so I could drop the note into her lap. She threw it onto the floor and demanded to know what it was. I answered, "A letter from Mrs. Dean." Hareton immediately seized it and said Heathcliff should see it first, but he threw the letter on the floor near Cathy when she began to cry. She picked it up and read it eagerly, and then asked me about Thrushcross Grange, and sighed. "I wish I could be there," she said wistfully, as she leaned her pretty head against the window. "I'm tired and bored, Hareton." I asked her to write a reply for Mrs. Dean, and she claimed she would like to, but could not because she had nothing to write with, nor a piece of paper to write on. She complained, "I don't even have a book from which I could tear a page." I was shocked. "How can you live here without books?" She said, "I was always reading books when I had them in my possession, but Heathcliff does not read, so he destroyed them. Joseph has some books on religion, and I know that Hareton has a secret collection of my books in his room. He can't read them, so he won't let me read them either." Hareton was embarrassed and he blushed. I said, "Hareton wants to learn and be like you. Perhaps in a few years he will be a clever student." She replied, "And meanwhile he wants me to become stupid. Sometimes I can hear him trying to read, and it is incredibly funny because he makes so many mistakes and then he swears." She laughed. Earnshaw was upset now because he was laughed at for being stupid, and then laughed at again for trying to improve himself. I agreed with him and felt he was treated unfairly. I said, "We all had to start the learning process somewhere, and if our teachers laughed at us, instead of helping us, we would still be making mistakes." She said, "I don't want to stop his learning, but I do think he should not take what is mine and make it sound ridiculous." Hareton went upstairs and came down with some books and threw them on Cathy's lap. "Take them," he shouted. "I don't want them any more. In fact, I never want to see them again." "I don't want them either," she said. "They will make me think of you, and I will hate them." She took one of the books and began to imitate Hareton by reading it in the poor way that she heard him read it. She laughed and Hareton reacted violently and hit her. He picked up the books and destroyed them by throwing them in the fire, although I could see on his face that it hurt him to do it. He was very angry and went outside, just as Heathcliff was entering. Heathcliff's entry did not stop Hareton's departure, and they passed each other without speaking. When Cathy saw Heathcliff coming, she left the room, so I was alone when Heathcliff entered. I told him that I intended to leave Thrushcross Grange, and offered to pay my lease in full. Heathcliff accepted this offer, and invited me to join his household for dinner. It was a terribly dreary meal because Cathy was instructed to eat in the kitchen, and Heathcliff and Hareton were both completely silent. As I left, I thought how different life would be for Cathy if I befriended her and took her to London. Chapter 27. Mr. Lockwood returns to Wuthering Heights. In September of this current year, I was invited to hunt on the moors by a friend in the north, and my journey to his home took me close to Thrushcross Grange. I decided to visit and stay the night there, since I still maintained the lease. I passed through the village and noticed the grey church was greyer, and the lonely churchyard was lonelier. When I arrived at the Grange, I asked for Mrs. Dean, and the servant told me that she lived at Wuthering Heights now. I introduced myself to the new housekeeper, and explained that I was the master and wanted to stay for the night. She was surprised and hurried to make a room ready for me, even though I told her not to hurry, since I wanted to go for a walk anyway. My footsteps took me to Wuthering Heights. The sun was setting behind me, and the moon rising in front of me, and by the time I arrived, it was almost pitch black. The gate was open, and I noticed new flowers in the garden growing among the fruit trees. I could hear the voices of Cathy and Hareton through a partially open window, and I heard her teaching him to read and correcting his mistakes. When he did things correctly, he asked for and received a kiss. I found myself jealous and thought of the opportunity I might have had, but most likely lost when I left the Grange. They came to the door, and it was clear that they were intending to walk on the moors. I did not want to be discovered, so I quickly moved to the kitchen entrance. There I found Mrs. Dean singing, and old Joseph complaining about it. Mrs. Dean recognized me immediately. "Mr. Lockwood," she exclaimed. "We did not know you were coming. Thrushcross Grange just shut up." She was apologetic. I told her not to worry since they were preparing a room for me there, and my stay was quite short as I planned to travel further the next day. I asked her why she was at Wuthering Heights, and she told me that soon after I left for London, Zillah left and Heathcliff wanted her to come there. I asked to see the master in order to pay the remainder of my rent. It was then she told me I would have to pay her because Heathcliff was dead. I was surprised at this news, and I asked how long ago he had passed away. She replied his death happened a mere 3 months before and invited me to sit and listen to the story. She began the tale. When I first came back to Wuthering Heights, I was shocked and disappointed at Cathy's disgraceful appearance. Heathcliff told me he didn't want to see Cathy, and it was now my responsibility to look after her. I brought some books from Thrushcross Grange and hoped these would make her happy. However, Cathy was not happy because she was not allowed to go beyond the garden and picked quarrels with Hareton as often as she could. She said he was like a farm animal that did nothing other than work, eat, and sleep. Cathy said, "You must have a boring life." She turned to me and said, "Do you know, Ellen, he was once learning to read and stopped because I laughed at him. Wasn't he a fool?" I asked, "But weren't you naughty?" She answered, "Perhaps I was, but I did not expect him to be a fool." She turned her attention back to Hareton and asked, "Hareton, if I gave you a book now, would you take it?" He remained silent, and when she placed a book on his knee, he threw it off and threatened to break her neck. She picked it up and put it on the table. She said she was going to bed and secretly asked me to watch whether Hareton touched the book or not. He didn't, and I told her so in the morning. She was incredibly disappointed. She began reading her books to me whenever Hareton was there. He was there a lot after he had an accident with his gun and was forced to stay home during his recovery. On Easter Monday, Joseph went to the village with some cattle, and Hareton sat by the fire smoking his pipe. Cathy approached him, seized his pipe, and threw it in the fire. She said she was glad to be his cousin and wanted to be friends. At first he was very angry and told her to go to hell. He would go to hell himself before he would be her friend. I told him he should try to be friends. His reply to my suggestion was vehement, and he exclaimed that Cathy hated him. Cathy denied this. "I don't hate you. It is you who hates me, and you hate me even more than Heathcliff does." Hareton said, "That's a lie. In fact, I have often made him angry by trying to protect you, even though you hate me." She declared she had never known that, adding, "I was unhappy and hated everyone, but now I thank you and ask you to forgive me." She held out her hand to him, but he ignored it. She bent down and kissed his cheek instead. Then she thoughtfully wrapped a book in white paper and tied it neatly with a ribbon. She asked me to give it to Hareton and tell him that she would help him read if he accepted her gift. I put it on his knee, but he did not open it. I was relieved to notice that although he didn't accept it right away, he did not throw it off either. Finally, he unwrapped the book and Cathy approached him and asked him to forgive her. I could not hear their conversation, but a few minutes later, I saw them sitting close together and looking at the book. When Joseph came home, he was utterly shocked to see them sitting on the same sofa. Cathy went to bed happier that night than she had ever been before in that house. In the next few days, they became very good friends, and I hope that one day I shall attend their wedding. The next morning, Hareton was still unable to do his usual work due to his injury, so instead he came down early to do some easy work in the garden. Cathy saw him there and persuaded him to make a flower bed in the middle of the currant trees. When I saw this flower bed, I was terrified because the currant trees were Joseph's favorite trees, and I knew he would be furious. As they came in for breakfast, I warned Cathy not to outwardly show her friendliness with Hareton to Heathcliff, and she said she understood. At breakfast, Cathy and Hareton sat close together, and she put some flowers in his porridge, which almost made Hareton laugh aloud. Cathy did it again, and eventually he could not stop himself and he laughed. His efforts to hide it were not successful. Heathcliff was annoyed and mistakenly thought it was Cathy who laughed. He yelled at her to stop it, but Hareton interjected and told him it was not Kathy but he who laughed. Heathcliff was shocked because this laughter was beyond his comprehension. "Why do you laugh?" he demanded. Before Hareton could answer, Joseph appeared at the door and was visibly upset because the trees had been disturbed. He demanded his wages and said he would leave because Hareton dug up his garden. Heathcliff asked Hareton if this was true, and Kathy admitted that she had asked him to do it. She told Heathcliff she wanted to plant some flowers there. Heathcliff was furious when he discovered that Kathy and Hareton were friends now. She shouted at Heathcliff, "You have taken all my land and all my money, and you've taken all Hareton's land and money, too. You should let me have some room in the garden for my flowers." "Silence. You are a witch, and you never had any land or money." Heathcliff swore and cursed viciously, and it was terrible to hear. He got up and raised his hand to strike her. She said, "If you strike me, then Hareton will strike you." "Throw her into the kitchen, or I'll kill her," cried Heathcliff. He called her names too terrible to repeat, and although Hareton tried to persuade Kathy to leave, she wouldn't. Heathcliff came to her and seized her hair. Hareton tried to loosen his grip and begged him not to hurt her this time. I tried to help, but suddenly Heathcliff released his grip on her hair and drew his hand across his eyes. He stood still for a moment before speaking to Kathy. He said, "You will have to learn to avoid making me angry, or I really will kill you one day. Go with Mrs. Dean and stay with her, and be warned that if I catch Hareton listening to you again, I will evict him from the house." We all left the room and did not reunite until dinner. Heathcliff did not speak to anyone during the meal, ate very little, and went out immediately afterwards, saying he would not return until evening. During the afternoon, Kathy tried to tell Hareton about the terrible things Heathcliff had done to her father, but Hareton told her to stop it. He asked, "How would you like me to say bad things about your father?" Kathy understood that Hareton thought of Heathcliff as a father, and refrained from saying anything negative about him. They went back to their books, and I saw that Hareton was learning quickly and returning to the good nature he had possessed as a small child. It was wonderful to see, and I could not contain my happiness. Heathcliff returned that evening, as the young couple sat by the fire studying a book, and when he saw them, he looked upset and came to the fire. They looked up at him, and their 4 eyes looked more than ever like Catherine Earnshaw's eyes. Heathcliff lifted the book from Hareton's hand, looked at it, and then signed for Kathy to leave and Hareton to follow. I was leaving too, but he stopped me. He said, "It is a strange end, for I have worked hard and long to destroy the 2 families, and now when I could easily finish it, I find I don't really care. What is the use? Something very strange is happening, Nellie. I am changing, and I take so little interest in daily life that I almost forget to eat and drink. The sight of Hareton disturbs me, because he looks more and more like Catherine. Not long ago he was a copy of my youth, being almost inhuman, but now the sight of him torments me. I do not want to see him, and I don't care what he and Kathy do." I asked, "What do you mean by changing?" I was perplexed because he did not look ill or close to death. He answered, "I will not know until it comes." I asked if he felt ill, but he responded in the negative. I then asked, "Are you afraid of death?" "Afraid?" he exclaimed. "I am not afraid of death, nor do I hope for it. I will probably live to an old age, but I cannot go on as I am because I have to remind myself to breathe and my heart to beat. I have only one wish, and my whole heart is trying to make it come true, so I am sure that I will achieve my goal soon." He began to pace the length of the room while he murmured, swore, and cursed. I ended my night, wondering how it would end. Chapter 28. The 3 Graves. For a few days after that tumultuous meeting, Heathcliff did not join us for meals. One night after the family members had retired for bed, I heard Heathcliff leave from the front door, but I never heard him return. In the morning I discovered he was still absent, and I never learned of his whereabouts. It was April and the weather was wonderfully sweet and comfortably warm, and everyone enjoyed the fruit trees that were in blossom. Kathy asked me to keep her company, in a corner of the garden where Hareton was working in the flower bed that had since been moved due to Joseph's complaints. Kathy went down to the gate to get some roots for the garden and returned to tell us that Heathcliff was coming. She looked surprised and mentioned that he had spoken to her, and Hareton inquired as to what he said. She replied, "He told me to go as quickly as I could, but he looked so different that I had to stop and look at him." Hareton asked, "How was he different?" Kathy answered, "Almost bright and cheerful." No more than almost. He looked extremely excited and wild and glad. I was surprised and decided to see for myself, since Heathcliff did rarely, if ever, look glad. I entered and saw him standing in the open doorway. He was rather pale and trembling, but Kathy was right. He did have a look of unusual joy in his eyes that altered the appearance of his entire face. I asked if he cared for any breakfast, as I assumed he might be hungry after walking around all night, but he rejected the offer by telling me he was not hungry. My curiosity was piqued, and I wanted to discover where he had gone, but did not dare ask him. I commented, "You shouldn't stay outside all night, for the nights are still cold. You should be in bed, or you will get sick. In fact, I think you are already sick now." He replied, "It's nothing, and I can bear it with pleasure if you leave me alone." As I went past him, I noticed that his breathing was rapid. At dinner time, he repeated that he did not have a cold, as if trying to convince us that no illness could consume him. He picked up his knife and fork and was about to eat when he looked toward the window. I don't know what he saw, but he put down his utensils and went out the door. We saw him walking up and down the length of the garden. Hareton went out to ask if he would come back in to eat his dinner, but he refused. When he finally did return to the house, about an hour had passed, and he was grinning and trembling. He looked very strange, so I asked him if there was a problem. He replied there was no problem. Then he said, "I'm hungry, but I must not eat. Perhaps I will eat later tonight. Please tell everybody to avoid me today, because I want to be left alone." I asked a string of questions. "Mr. Heathcliff, why must we avoid you? Are you ill? Why are you so strange? Where were you last night?" He replied, "It's none of your business, but I will tell you anyway. Last night I was close to hell, but today I am close to my heaven. In fact, it's only 3 feet away." He would tell me no more, but sent me out of the room. All the household members left him alone in the room all afternoon. That evening I decided to bring him some food. First, I went up to light the fire, and I found all the windows open, so I began to close them. Heathcliff's face was pale, and he smiled an awful smile, and I simply cannot convey how dreadful it was. His eyes were so black and frightening that I dropped my candle in sheer fright. I sent Joseph in with the food, but he brought it back and said the master did not want any food and was retiring for the evening. We heard him go up the stairs, but he did not go to his usual room. Instead, he went to the bedroom Zillah gave you, Mr. Lockwood, when you visited here for the first time. That room has a window large enough to get through, and I thought that he intended to go out again that night. I went to bed but slept badly. I dreamed that Heathcliff was dead, and I saw his headstone with just the name Heathcliff on it, for that was the only name he ever had. In the morning I went downstairs and looked under the window for any footsteps, but I saw no indication that Heathcliff had ventured out during the night. Good, I thought. He did not go out last night, and perhaps he will be better today. I made breakfast for everyone, and I went outside to set up a table under the trees for Kathy and Hareton, because they liked to have their breakfast there. When I came back in, Heathcliff was there talking to Joseph, and his facial expression still conveyed excitement. Joseph went out and Heathcliff sat at the table. I poured him some coffee, and he stared at the wall with shining eyes, and sometimes he stopped breathing for a few moments. I urged him to eat and drink, but he smiled that awful smile at me instead. He asked if we were alone. I answered, "We are alone." I looked more closely at him and saw that he was not looking at the wall, but at something between the wall and us, although I could not see anything there. I tried again to make him eat, but again he ignored me. I waited, but he became annoyed and told me to leave him alone. I didn't say another word, and then he got up and walked out of the house and through the gate. He returned very late that night, and I could hear him pacing incessantly in the room below mine. I went down with the intention of seeing if he needed anything. When he heard me in the kitchen, he called me in and asked me to make a fire in the room, even though it was 4 o'clock in the morning. As I made the fire, he walked up and down, murmured, and sighed repeatedly. He said, "I must call the lawyer in the morning, because I have not created a will yet, and I must decide what to do with my property." I told him he should not speak like that, and that he should eat and rest. He replied, "It is not my fault that I cannot eat or rest. I will do both when I can, but now I am too happy." "Happy?" I exclaimed. "This is a strange happiness." He said, "I am very close to my heaven, and I don't care about the heaven of others." He stayed by himself that entire day. In the evening, he went to his room, and we heard him groan and murmur all night long. The next morning we called the doctor, but Heathcliff locked his door and again insisted he was not sick and didn't need a doctor, so the doctor left. The next night was very rainy. In the morning I walked outside and saw Heathcliff's window open and the rain was pouring in. I thought, he cannot be in bed because it is under the window and he will be wet. He must be out, but I will go up and see. I unlocked the door with another key and found Heathcliff lying on the bed with that terrible smile plastered on his face. He was dead, but when I tried to close his eyes, they would not shut. I called Joseph, and we sent for the doctor, but even Dr. Kenneth could not declare a cause of death. We buried him in the churchyard next to Catherine Linton, and I sincerely hope he is at peace. People in the village, however, say that he still walks, and they tell stories about people who meet him on rainy nights. I once met a boy with some sheep who would not pass by a certain point on the path, because the boy said he saw Heathcliff and a woman there. The sheep were clearly frightened too, and would not move forward along that path. I do not believe in ghosts, Mr. Lockwood. No, I believe the dead are at peace, but I will be happy when Hareton and Cathy leave this house and go to Thrushcross Grange after their marriage. Joseph will board up the rest of Wuthering Heights with a helper to keep him company. After she finished her story, I thanked Mrs. Dean and pressed some money into her hand, against her protests. I said goodbye to her and Joseph, and walked back to Thrushcross Grange past the churchyard. I found the 3 headstones next to each other and rested there a moment. I wondered how anyone could think that the people who lay there were at peace.
Playlet. A visitor to Wuthering Heights. Hindley, Heathcliff, and Catherine are sitting at a table. They do not look at each other or speak to each other. Mrs. Dean is standing in the background. Joseph enters and brings them each a bowl of porridge. They begin to eat in silence. After a few bites, Hindley pushes his bowl away and stands up.
"I have to go out. I'll be away all day. Heathcliff, go and work in the back field today. Prepare it for planting."
Just
do as I say."
Heathcliff stands up and looks at Hindley angrily. He walks out of the room.
"Can't you be nice to him? You used to think of him as a brother."
"Never. I always hated him. You are too friendly with him. It will get you into trouble. He's only a servant."
Hindley walks out of the room angrily.
"Joseph."
"Yes, miss."
"Joseph, I want you to take a message to the Grange. Tell Edgar that Hindley is away today, and that Heathcliff will be working in the fields. Invite him to come here today."
"I don't think the master."
"Just do as I say."
Catherine stands up and leaves the room. Joseph looks at Mrs. Dean and shrugs his shoulders. "There is going to be trouble."
"Perhaps, Joseph, perhaps, but we are used to that, aren't we?"
Joseph stares at her and leaves. Mrs. Dean begins to pick up the empty bowls from the table. Hindley comes back in.
"Mrs. Dean, I want you to do something for me. If anyone comes to visit Catherine, especially Edgar Linton, please stay in the room with them at all times. I do not trust Catherine. She and Edgar Linton are not allowed to be alone together. Do you understand?"
"Yes, Mr. Hindley. I'll do my best.
Good. Now, I must go.
Hindley leaves the room, and Mrs. Dean continues cleaning up. Catherine comes back in, wearing a nice dress. Mrs. Dean looks at her, but says nothing. She finishes cleaning up and leaves the room. Catherine fusses with her dress and hair, making certain that she looks pretty. Heathcliff enters. He leans against the mantelpiece and watches her. Suddenly, Catherine sees him.
Heathcliff, I thought you'd gone. What are you doing here?
I live here.
Yes, but aren't you working in the back field today?
No.
I'm sure that's what Hindley told you to do.
So? I don't feel like it today. I'll stay here with you. We can go for a walk if you like.
I don't want to go for a walk. Hindley will be angry with you.
Why are you wearing your best dress? Is somebody coming to visit?
No, you should be out in the fields.
So why are you in your best dress?
I like wearing it, so why shouldn't I? Besides, Edgar and Isabella might come to visit. If they do, you will get into trouble for not working.
Send them away. Tell them you are busy. Stay with me. Heathcliff walks across the room to where there is a calendar on the wall. Look, the red crosses are the evenings you spend with the Lintons, and the red circles are evenings you spend with me. There are more red crosses than circles.
What? Do you really count them? It doesn't mean that I like them more than you. It's not a competition. That's really stupid, Heathcliff. It's boring.
Edgar enters. He looks happy and cheerful. Mrs. Dean comes in with Edgar. Heathcliff looks angry and leaves.
Hello, Edgar. How nice to see you again.
Hello, Catherine.
Mrs. Dean, isn't there some work for you to do in the kitchen? There are a few things I need to do in here first. I'm sure there is work for you to do in the kitchen.
Catherine pinches Mrs. Dean's arm, making sure that Edgar does not see her do it.
Ow! You have no right to hurt me. I didn't touch you. You are lying. What's this then? Oh, you!
Catherine slaps Mrs. Dean's face.
Catherine, please, I think...
Don't you take her side. She's just a servant.
All the same, you can't...
I can't what? I know what I can do and what I can't do. I can do as I like.
Catherine hits Edgar. Edgar is very surprised. He turns away from Catherine and begins to walk out of the room.
Don't go!
I must go. How can I stay with you? You hit me. You lied. I can't believe it. You. I will go, and I will never return. Goodbye, Catherine.
You will be unhappy.
Yes, I will be unhappy, but I will not come back.
Catherine falls to her knees near a chair and begins to cry loudly. Edgar walks toward the door. Mrs. Dean follows him.
You are right, Mr. Linton. You should go. She is a bad girl. You'd better go home.
Edgar looks back at Catherine for a long moment before he turns and goes out.